characteristics of this God?
Okay, well, first of all, we're not talking about any higher level or additional attributes. All we're talking about is God as ultimate creator and a mind and as the source of all possibility and impossibility. Do you believe that there are one or more facts that exist without the necessity of referencing God?
I don't believe that anything is dependent on God because I don't believe in the God.
Then God cannot exist in that. If that's true, then God cannot coexist in that world. So your position is an indirect denial of God. Do you realize that?
So you're talking about implicit versus implicit kind of concept.
That's right. You can explicitly or implicitly deny God. You are implicitly denying God by invoking that there are facts that do not necessitate referencing God. Your position necessarily entails the falsity of God. Are we clear?
Yeah, and it entails also having a clear understanding of defining this God.
Okay, I already defined it for you. Now, what we're talking about is your atheism. Okay, I didn't mention about what I believe. We're talking about your atheism. Now, before we proceed,
please don't personalize that.
Are we clear that your position entails the falsity of God?
I don't agree with that because I'm not taking an anti-theistic position. I'm more neutral.
I didn't say anti-theistic. Okay, now. Do you believe that there are one or more facts that exist without the necessity of standing in causal relations to God?
Well, that's how it seems, so sure.
Okay, good. Then your position entails the falsity of God, then. It necessarily follows.
No, it's not necessary because
it necessarily follows, Randall.
Because these facts could still be independent of a God existing.
You're not understanding. Okay, God cannot exist in a world where even one temporal fact does not necessitate referencing him. Okay, do you understand? There's only two worlds: world where God exists and where all temporal facts necessitate referencing him, and another world is where facts do not necessitate referencing God because God could not exist in that world. Okay, so there's only two worlds, Randolph. Now, you have chosen that the world that you are in is that there are one or more temporal facts that do not necessitate referencing God. Okay, it necessarily follows that God cannot exist in that world, Randolph.
You're attempting to limit the scope to two possible worlds. I'm not convinced
I gave you a true dichotomy, Randolph. It's a true dichotomy. Okay, either facts necessitate referencing the necessity of God, or they do not. That is a true dichotomy. Okay.
It's one with limited scope, though.
Is it a true dichotomy?
No, because you've limited the scope.
Randolph, if I say A or not A, is that a true dichotomy?
Generally, yeah.
Good. So we're saying facts either necessitate God or not. That's a true dichotomy, Randolph.
Yeah, you're talking about, but the scope that you've limited is to say all facts.
Randolph, I have given you a true dichotomy. Okay, Are you clear now?
Oh yeah, I'm clear.
Okay, so there's not a third option. Now,
I'm objecting to that.
Okay, okay, if I say A or not A, what's the third option?
Oh, but that's a dichotomy there that doesn't have a limited.
If I say facts necessitate God or not, what's the third option?
Some facts do and some facts don't.
That's a dichotomy right there.
No, because you're specifying facts in plural.
Randolph, you can't have a world where some facts reference God and others don't. In a world where God is, because God is defined as the necessary precondition of all facts. It's definitional. You cannot have a world where some facts necessitate referencing God and others don't. Either all facts would necessitate referencing God because of the way God is defined, or no facts would necessitate God. I have given you a true dichotomy. I've explained it now clearly 3 times. The third option that you try to defeat the dichotomy, say that some facts necessitate God where others don't, that world cannot exist under how we have defined God. If you're talking about God, if you're talking about a God who is not ultimate and the necessary precondition of all facts, that would be a different subject. But that's not what we're talking about. Okay? So we have a true dichotomy here. Are we clear, Randolph?
I disagree with it being a true dichotomy. And
Randolph, what's the third option? Because
Yeah, you did well, Randolph.
So, Crispy just said...
I apologize on behalf of Christians, Randolph.
Nobody has to...
Meanwhile, at the Legion of Doom...
Idiot. Oh my goodness, I can't.
Oh my God. This is the guy who's the head of Canadian Atheists. I mean, have you ever heard, and you're going to have to excuse me, folks, have you ever heard such a dumb fuck in your whole life?
What happened? What happened, man? What happened?
The guy is such an
oh
idiot.
My gosh.
Oh my goodness.
This guy is as dumb as a 5th grader. And he claims he's the head of American Atheists. I pointed out to him that his position entails the falsity of God. And he says only implicitly, not explicitly. And I said, it makes no difference. I said, either way, your position entails the falsity of God. Now, I said, how is it that God does not exist? And he said, that's not a position I hold to.
What an idiot. Oh my, I can't how much of an idiot.
Listen,
Man,
there's one word, listen, there's one word that describes this guy. He is retarded. Okay?
Well, I guess we can see why he avoided you for 10 months.
You see, this is why it's a waste of time. He admitted.
That's really mean.
He admitted. Shut up.
He's really not.
Okay. Hey, Elliot, what are you drinking? The Kool-Aid? Either Randolph Richardson is profoundly stupid, or he's a completely disingenuous, deceitful person masquerading behind a polite Canadian. Okay? And I accept the latter. What's that?
He's neither.
What?
I said he's neither. I don't think he's either of those things.
Okay,
That's
you're
a false dichotomy.
Well, hold on a second. No, there's not a third option. Listen very carefully. Okay? I gave him a true dichotomy. He denied the true dichotomy. Then he had to backpedal and say it was a true dichotomy. Then when I said your position entails the falsity of God, he says not explicitly, and I said it doesn't matter. Your position still entails that God does not exist. Okay? He agreed that his position entails implicitly the falsity of God, but that he's not explicitly saying God does not exist, but he's saying God does not exist implicitly. Okay? Are we clear so far, Elliot?
I think we'll just agree to disagree.
Okay, you know what? You can fuck off, you little piece of garbage. Okay? That's what we call a scumbag troll. Okay? Look, how do you converse and debate with somebody who's deliberately stuck on stupid like Randolph Richardson? I mean, he was appallingly retarded, or if he's not retarded, he's just outright deceitful.
I think he was just in denial. He did not want to admit that he was, utterly a complete
he was being deceitful.
Yeah,
I explained to him, if you say something and by implication it denies God, it doesn't matter that you're not explicitly denying God. You're still denying God. This would hold up this would hold up in a court of law. Okay? And so I said, good. So your position, even though it is implicit rather than explicit, still entails the falsity of God. So I then said to him, after he agreed that his position implicitly entails the falsity of God, I said, how is it that God does not exist? He goes, that's not a position that I hold to. You can't make this up. And by the way, just to let you know, he's actually good friends with Neil the 604 atheist, and they're building some stupid podcast studio together. Tweedledee and Tweedledum. I'm just frustrated because here I have somebody who puts himself forward. There's no third option. Either he's fundamentally stupid or he's deceitful. But you know what he is? He's deceitful. He couldn't be that dumb. Okay? Now, he categorically admitted, by implication, he is affirming the non-existence of God. Okay? He admitted this. So I then said to him, how is it that God doesn't exist? And he goes, that's not a position that I hold to. Now, how do you converse with somebody like that?
You can't. That's the answer. You cannot.
I mean, the level of deception is shocking. You see, he had to admit that by implication, he was denying God. And then I said, okay, so your position entails the denial of God. He says, yes, implicitly. I said, good. How is it that God doesn't exist? And he goes, that's not a position I hold to.
Well, like I said, man, he avoided you for 10 months for a reason.
And this is, do you realize this guy says he's the head of some organization called Canadian Atheists? I can't even find out how many members there are at his website.
Maybe 4.
I would love to know. Now, do you realize how utterly infuriating it is to talk to a human being like this? You see, when I talk to people, I have a strong expectations that they're going to conduct themselves with a minimal of truthfulness, okay? And I wasn't getting that. What I was getting was full-blown deceit. Oh, that's not a position I hold to. Of course you hold to it by implication. Oh, but it's not explicit.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter, Randolph, that it's explicit. If it's implicit, an explicit or an implicit position, both equals the falsity of God. So your position is that there are temporal facts that don't reference God. Therefore, God cannot exist in that world. So I want to know, how is it that God doesn't exist? Oh, that's not a position I hold to. He repeatedly said this. You can't talk any further with this. He's pretending to be retarded.
Exactly.
Quick question.
And then people wonder why I get ticked off and I get angry with somebody like this. This is a guy who's on YouTube all the time. This is a guy who says, I'm Randolph Richardson, head and founder of Canadian Atheists. And I have teenagers who are more honest than this guy.
Mr. Darth, a quick question. Why did you leave philosophical checkmate? I wasn't there while you were in your room.
Because I was pissed I was getting muted because Randolph Richardson was overtly being deceptive and lying right to my face before everybody in the room.
Oh, you guys had like a mini debate?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
He was lying right to my face and to everybody in the room. I'll give you a brief synopsis, okay? Yeah. I said to him, do you believe that it is not necessary to reference God as the necessary precondition of all facts? He said, yes. I said, then it necessarily follows from that God cannot exist, okay? I then went on to explain to him the logical entailment with a true dichotomy that God can only exist in a world where facts necessitate referencing him. If there is a single fact that does not necessitate referencing God, then God cannot logically exist in that world. Okay?
Yeah.
Then I said to him, it's a true dichotomy. And he said, no, it's not. Now, wait till you hear this. He said, there could be a world where some facts reference God and others don't. And I said, no, that world cannot exist. It's a logical contradiction. Okay? He kept on trying to change the subject early on to Christianity. See, this is the tactic. I explained to him, either all facts necessitate referencing God, or no facts necessitate referencing God. Why? Because in a God world, God being creator and ultimate and...
Shut the fuck up. Shut the fuck up. Hello. Guess what we're gonna do? Were you around earlier for the shit show? That was that. Hold on a sec. You don't need that sitting in your face like that. Were you around earlier for the shit show? That was me and James Henry and Kalilula. Well, it was lots of. Firstly, I want to. I got to take my hat off to Kalilula and his group there. They trolled me. They trolled me good. But ultimately, it was about the James Henry situation, the psychopathy of James Henry. Now, the reason I think I got trolled by Khalil is simply because I embarrassed him. I played twice. I played his before he became flippity floppity Justin Downing. He was he gave this 20-minute speech on how faith without evidence is bullshit. You know, if you don't have empirical evidence, then you can take your faith and shove it up your ass because it means nothing. He said if you could have Islam, you could have Mormonism, you could have Christianity. They can't all be right. And he says they can all be wrong. So he, I guess he got a little bit butthurt and thought he'd go online and pretend to be this atheist trucker from the south. He did well, actually. It was pretty good. But the fact remains that he's kind of lost. Back to today. Back to right now, this episode. Let's get serious. Topics that I have lined up, and they all involve early Christianity. Okay? Women in early Christianity, and then we're going to have a look at Manichaeism. Now, when I say early Christianity, I mean all of Christianity before 325, before the Council of Nicaea. So, until the Council of Nicaea, there obviously wasn't one unified orthodox creed. And after that, there started to be. But until then, there wasn't. And I'm going to explore all the different Christianities and all the different thinkers up until the Council of Nicaea. Now, today, I have two topics chosen, and I had them on the screen a second ago. They're there. So, firstly, it's women in early Christianity, and then we're going to have a listen to what Manichaeism is all about, and that's just today. And then, if you'd like, we'll have an open discussion. And as usual, the historical Jesus is still on the table to be presented at some time or another. The reason that I keep on postponing it, of course, is that it's long. It's an hour long. And do you want to listen to an hour long at the end of an hour or 3 or 4? No, probably not. So it's there as my backup. Certainly in case nobody comes into the room. If I'm all jacked up for a room and no one comes in, then I'll sit and watch the historicity of Jesus by a Yale University lecturer any day of the week. So let me turn to the room, the chat room, of course, and say My good days to Bill. Hey, Bill. Bill P. You are. Yes. Oh, you're one of 2 concurrent viewers. My goodness, they double up, don't they? In no time, you've got double the viewers. Isn't that something? I love mathematics. So, I don't see any clamor in the side chat to start a Google Meet room yet. You all know the drill about the room. I haven't started it yet. What happened there? I left the meeting. Why does it say I left the meeting? Clicked on a window I shouldn't have clicked on. There we go. There we go. Blah, 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 blah. Okay. I'm talking women. I'm not talking women. I'm going to let Rebel, welcome. I am not talking, I'm going to let a lecturer named Kevin Katz talk women. And I'm going to let him do it pretty soon. This Kevin Katz, well, I'll tell you what, we can assess his credentials after he's given a talk on women in early Christianity. This one, it's about 15 minutes long. The Manichaeism one, well, there's 2 of them, so it's probably going to be a while. I would love to discuss the women part of it. Once the women's over, this one here, once this lecture is completed, this one by Kevin Katz, then I'd like the room to be opened up for healthy discussion. If that sounds, well, it does, it sounds great. So I'm just going to carry on and let the next 15 minutes take us away into early Christianity and the women represented therein.
Okay, so what we're going to do in this lecture is have our first talk about women in early Christianity. And what I thought I'd do to get us started is to give you a little introduction to women in Greco-Roman society or culture. And what Greco-Roman means is, of course, we're talking about the Roman Empire. Greece had been subsumed by Rome probably 150 years before this particular period. But a lot of what was happening in Greece was transferred into Rome, so sometimes you get it called the Greco-Roman culture. What I've shown you here on this slide is that there are 3 main points to talk about when we're talking about women in this particular culture, because what we find is that, of course, once Christianity gets started, you're still in Roman culture. So women were treated essentially the same. So this first point here is that women were subordinate and essentially the property of their husbands. Now, there are some exceptions to this, like all things, but this is in general true. Wealthy women, this is always the case in any society. Wealthy women had more options and were certainly the exceptions to this particular rule, especially when you've got the wives of senators or the empress, the wife of the emperor. And you also have, in terms of hierarchy, older previously married women were held in high esteem. So if their husbands had died, and usually if they're wealthy or wealthier. So a lot of these characteristics are wholesale taken into early Christianity. Okay, so what I want to start us off in terms of early Christianity is give you a little bit of background about why women were treated the way they were. There are really 2 creation stories in Genesis, and both of these creation stories had a pretty big impact on the way that women were treated. So what I've got here on this slide is the first, what I call the first creation story. It's Genesis 1:27 to 1:28. And if you want to stop the slide or stop the movie and pull out a Bible, you can certainly read the rest of this. And I'll just read this first verse from Genesis 1:27. So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Now, according to Genesis 1:26, it sounds like men and women were created at the same time, and they were both in God's image. So this is seen as sort of a positive representation of women in Genesis. Now you also have the second creation story, and this is the one that's much more popular, both in ancient culture and in modern culture, where you've got Genesis 2:7. I've given you here, which is the creation of the first man, or Adam, and then Genesis 20 down to 23 about the second creation story, about where women came from. So I gave you Genesis 2:7 just to show you that man came from the dust. God breathed into him, gave him life, and then made him a living being. And then after God created Adam, or the first man, he then created all the animals, and God noticed that man was lonely. So in Genesis 2:21, you've got God putting Adam to sleep, and then what he did was he took one of his ribs, closed it up, and then he made the first woman, Eve, out of his rib. And then you can see in 2:23, and then the man said, this at last is the bone of my bones, the flesh of my flesh. This is the one shall be called woman, for out of man this one was taken. Now again, this is the story that becomes much more popular. And as you can see, think about the differences between the stories I just gave you. The first one, it sounds like men and women were created at the same time in the image of God. In the second creation story, you've got Adam created first, and then from the dust. Now, a woman was not created from the dust like man was, like Adam was. She was taken from his body, a rib, and then created. So she was second. And then, of course, probably the biggest thing that impacted women in early Christianity was the story about Eve and the serpent. And what I've given you here is Genesis 3:1 to 3:6, and I'm not going to read this. What I'd like you to do is to stop the video and to read through this. But what you see here is that Eve went into the garden and ate from this tree, which God told her that she shouldn't. But she ended up doing, and then what she ended up doing is giving it to Adam, and then he ate it. So she gets blamed for all of this. And what I've given you here off to the right is an image from one of the cathedrals in Italy about Eve and the tree. So now remember the second creation story. You've got the woman created out of Adam, and now you've got this story where Eve is really the one who caused all of the original problems. This is what's going to be remembered by many of the church fathers in early Christianity. There are also other things that affected early Christian women that got a start in the Old Testament, and one was called the menstruation rules, and you can read this in Leviticus 15:19 and the following verses. And this is in the Old Testament, in case you're not familiar with Leviticus. Leviticus is a series of rules, really. So what you have here, and what I'd like you to do, is to stop the video and then read through this particular passage. And after you've done that, what you can see is that when a woman has her period, she is considered to be impure for 7 days, and anyone who touches her will be unclean. Anything that she sits on, anything she touches, and then whoever touches her bed, her clothes, anything needs to be cleaned. Anything who touches anything she sat on, and if they touched the water that she bathed in, will be unclean. And then what happens is that if anyone has sex with her, then the male will be unclean as well for 7 days. And there are a whole bunch of rules that have to be done to make her clean, and anyone who touches her after this. So this certainly played a negative impact on women in early Christianity as well. However, there were many women in the New Testament, and I mentioned this, I think, in the first lecture, that women were extremely important to the early Christian movement. They supported, and I'll talk about this in just a bit, they supported Paul, they supported many of the original apostles. There were certainly many women who followed Jesus, and you can see a few names here: Mary Magdalene, a woman named Joanna, and Susanna. You can see their names mentioned in the New Testament in Luke 8, 1-3. You can also see in Mark 15:40 through 15:41 that there were women who followed Jesus, and in 15:41 it specifically says that they provided for him. So women were invested in early Christianity, both in terms of providing support and material support and money, especially with Paul. You also find that after the crucifixion, the men all fled, but the women stayed. And you can read about this in Mark 16, 1-13. You've got Mary Magdalene again, you've got Mary, the mother of James, and a woman named Salome. And I make the point here that Mary Magdalene saw him first after the creation story, or after the crucifixion story, sorry. You also have the story of the bleeding woman in Mark 5:25-34, where she had been bleeding for a number of years, and she came up and touched the cloak of Jesus, and then she was healed. And I mentioned Paul just a bit ago. Paul and women go together in the New Testament. Paul would not have been able to do what he did, which of course was traveling around. If you remember those maps I showed you, he could not have done that without the support of women. And women, we know, owned their own houses, and they also had their own responsibilities in the church. And here I put they were responsible as leaders. You can read part of this in Romans 16:3, where he greets a number of women, and I've underlined some of these names: Prisca, Mary, Junia, and you can see here in 16:7, greet Andronicus and Junia, my relatives who are in prison with me. They were prominent among the apostles, and they were in Christ before I was. Now that the quote, they were prominent among apostles, has caused some difficulty for modern scholars, because it's unclear whether Junia was considered to be an apostle and they were prominent among those, or the apostles knew of Andronicus and Junia. Either way, they have a very important role that they played with Paul. In Romans 16, 1-2, you've got a woman named Phoebe, and she was definitely called a deacon. And you can read about, and I've given you that passage here. So if you want to stop the video, you can read about Phoebe. This is another slide showing you some of the evidence of women in the New Testament, especially in Paul's writings. So you've got in Philippians 4:2, Euodia and Syntyche. In 1 Corinthians 11:4-11:6, you also have women mentioned in a negative way, but what you have to do is unpack that and look at what's really going on. And so what I've titled this section here is Women Prayed and Prophesied Along Men. So if you look at 1 Corinthians 11:4, you see that any man who prophesies or prays with something on his head disgraces his head. But any woman who prays and prophesies with her head unveiled disgraces her head. So what you can get out of 11:5 is that clearly women were praying, which we already know, but they were also prophesying. So, and Paul really says that here. And if you look down the very bottom of this particular slide, you can see I've given you a bit of Acts 16-14, where Luke had many women helpers. Lydia in particular was a very important one. Now, this role of women, this important role of women, changes later. They are not written by Paul. And these are the pastorals, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, where you see the official roles of women were reduced or eliminated. And what you can see here in 1 Timothy 2:8 through 2:15, and what I'd like you to do is to stop the video and to read this particular section. Okay, so if you've looked through this, you can see that women are treated a little bit differently than what you see in the early writings of Paul. So he's talking about women should dress themselves modestly, not braid their hair, not put gold in it, pearls, wear expensive clothes, but do good things. 2:11, probably one of the most talked about verses in 1 Timothy. Let a woman learn in silence with full submission. So you can see this is very different from those earlier writings where Paul is thanking women who are working, who are teaching people. And you can see in 2:12, I permit no woman to teach or have authority over man. She is to keep silent. And what's really important here is 2:13. This is the reason why. For Adam was formed first and then Eve. Now, and then you see, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. So as you can see, the author of 1 Timothy, and again, we don't know who this is ignoring that first creation story where man and women were created together. Instead, he or she, but probably he, has taken the second creation story where Adam is created first and then Eve. And this is the reason why these early Christians in this particular area were rolling back the control that women had. Okay, and what I have here is more from 1 Timothy on the treatment of women. And again, there's a lot of text here. I'm not going to read this to you. So what I'd like you to do is to turn off the video and then to read this. But again, think about how women were treated in the earlier part of the New Testament writings and how they're being treated now. Okay, and in this last slide, I do want to point out that women
Thank you so much, Bill. I don't know what I'd do without Bill. Thank you for unmuting me or telling me that I'm muted. But the point is that we've had enough of this. We get the point that women are shit, according to the Bible. Women, I mean, they're transgressors, right? Simply because they're women, they're transgressors. It says so. But what I did want to say, actually, I'm going to repeat it. I just want to sort of get back into talking about Christianity in the first 3 centuries. Christianity before the Council of Nicaea, Christianities as they existed. There were tons of them, millions of them. I also want to discuss at some point why we're not talking about all the written material from over the time period from the beginning of the second millennium, or the beginning of the, what am I trying to say? From the beginning of the Common Era. That's what I'm trying to say. So I need to know an answer to that question. Sure, we look at the canon, we look at the scriptures and all that kind of stuff, but there are tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of material that wasn't included following the Council of Nicaea and on. Why not? Surely it's got to be of some value if it was man that decided what went in there and what didn't go in there. It was man decided what went in there and it was taken out later. It was man all the way. So we're going to look at all that probably through the professional brains of podcasts like History in the Bible, History of the Early Church, stuff like that. What I also wanted to do was say, what's up? Okay. Quiet and silent. Was to, these are the topics that we're discussing today. So the women, Manichaeism, and then open discussion. We can, if you like, switch the open discussion to right now. If you join, the link is up. And the link is up everywhere, I think. Yes. Let's put it up here as well. So I'm going to put it over there as well. There you go. Call, don't call. If you don't call, then we're going to go to Manichaeism. Manichaeism, I have 2 videos. One is, while I'm waiting for it to load, one is on Manichaeism. Again, it's Kevin Katz, same guy. And then the next one, we go back to Yale University for some St. Augustine Confessions, which is a little bit later than Manichaeism, but at least he references Manichaeism in the Confessions, I believe. Learning this stuff just like everybody else is. Okay. Let me go check the Google Meet room and see if there's anyone there. Let's go check. Let me go check. Ooh, that's not the Google Meet room. That's not the Google Meet room. That's the Google Meet room. Oh, gee. Well, there's no one there. So I guess we can just carry on with Manichaeism. Our friend Kevin Katz. Take it away. Kevin.
It's a religion that showed up in the 200s or the 3rd century called Manichaeism. And I mentioned this earlier. I'm really interested in this particular religion because it's the one that I did my PhD on. So it's always kind of fun for me to talk about that. The Manichaeans were named after their founder, Mani. He was born in 216 and died in 276. And what you're looking at here in these 3 images, these were taken from Manichaean manuscripts from Asia, because what happened is that early on, the Manichaean religion was persecuted, and part of it went west into the Roman Empire, and another part went east into Asia. We know, according to Mani's writings, that he got a start in what are called the Twin Cities, Seleucia and Ctesiphon, and this is where he grew up. So this particular area, I don't know if I should try and draw a border here, but about right here, anything on this side belonged to the Persian Empire, and anything on this side belonged to the Roman Empire. So it got a start in Persia, but it's definitely a Christian religion. We know quite a bit about Mani, primarily because of a text that was discovered in 1969 called the Cologne Mani Codex. And it's called Cologne because it's kept in Cologne, Germany, so that's why it's called that. This is a very tiny manuscript. It's about 2 inches by 1 inch, and a number of pages. So there's been lots of speculation about why it's small. Maybe it's small so you could keep it next to you hidden, and so on. It's a very important text for the study of Manichaeism, because before this time, or a little bit before this time, mostly what you'd have in terms of information about Manichaeism came from its detractors. So there's always problems with that. Now we're seeing many more Manichaean texts coming out, including some that are still coming out today. So we know from the Cologne Mani Codex that Mani was brought up in a Jewish sect called the Alkasites, a Jewish Christian sect called the Alkasites. They were really big on baptizing, and according to the Cologne Mani Codex, Mani started receiving visions when he was young from the Holy Spirit. And what the Holy Spirit told him to do is to go out and to spread this new religion that it was going to teach him. Now, there is some question here about whether Mani sees himself as the Holy Spirit or he was contacted by the Holy Spirit. I mean, people have written about this for quite a while. Now, what I've given you here is parts of the Cologne Mani Codex 3 and 4. And what I'd like you to do is to stop the video and take a look at this. And what you see here is these are his writings on this Holy Spirit that was giving him all of this information. You also see him mentioning some other texts within the Cologne Mani Codex. One is called the Gospel of his Holy Hope, or the Gospel of his All Holy Hope. And what you can see here is that Mani is starting to refer to himself as the Apostle of Jesus Christ. Through the will of God, the Father of Truth, for whom I came into being. And then he talks about part of his mission in this particular work.
Now, I told you that Manichaeism got its start in Persia. According to some of the Manichaean texts and some anti-Manichaean texts, we know that Mani ultimately ended up meeting with the Persian king named Shapur I. Mani liked him enough to even write a book for him called the Shaburagan. And what's really interesting about Manichaeism and about the Shaburagan in particular is that the Manichaeans were excellent in terms of adapting their religion to the local environment. So I had mentioned that he was brought up in Persia. What you find is a Christian religion in Persia that adapted a lot of Persian religious factors, religious deities, and so on. When Manichaeism goes to the Roman West, it adopts a fully Christianized language. And when it goes east into Asia, it adopts a lot of Buddhist parts. So what you've got here is, apart from the Shaburagan, and what it says is there are messengers. One was Buddha to India, another was Zoroaster to Persia, Jesus to the West, and then Mani claims that he is the last of these messengers, and he's the messenger of truth. You also have this same passage showing up in another Manichaean work called the Kephaliah. The Kephaliah, and along with a few other Manichaean writings, were found in Egypt, and they're written in the language called Coptic. We don't think that was the original language. They were probably Greek and then translated into Coptic, but we have the Coptic versions. And as you read through this, you can see here that it's talking about the coming of the apostle Mani. So it gives a list of the previous apostles, and there's ones I just talked about: Buddha, Zarathustra coming to Persia. He's the same as Zoroaster. And you've got Jesus Christ, or Jesus the Christ, and then you have Mani mentioned. Okay, I just mentioned that Mani was in Persia and was friends with Shapur I. Shapur I was well known in the Roman Empire for being an extremely strong Persian king. The Romans and the Persians had been fighting for a very long time, and a lot of this fighting really peaked in the middle of the 200s. In fact, Shapur was so strong that he ended up capturing one of the Roman emperors named Valerian. This was done in a battle, and the Romans never tried to recapture the emperor, so they left him in Persia to die. Some writers say that Mani was even on this particular campaign, but that's unclear. The two other Persian kings that are important to the story of the history of Manichaeism, one was Hormizd, and as far as we know, you can see he didn't rule very long. He was sort of friends with Mani, but then you get down to this king, Bahram, or sometimes it's Bahram with a B. He did not like Mani at all. And part of what's going on here is you've got this priest named Kurdur, who is a Zoroastrian priest. He did not like Mani at all, and he and Bahram made sure that Mani could not preach in Persia, and then ended up killing him. You've got this story told in a number of different Manichaean texts. One is called the Manichaean Psalm Book, and this is the largest collection of psalms we have from antiquity. I've given you here a bit of 43.5 through 21, and these are the lines and the page number. You can see here that it's talking about Shapur, King Shapur. You've got Hormizd, and then you've got the story of Bahram, who, according to the Manichaean Psalm Book, did not like Mani at all. Okay, you also have mention of these Zoroastrians, or they're called Magians in the Manichaean texts. And again, I've given you a bit of the Manichaean Psalm Book, 16.9 through 23, where you've got mention of Bahram, called the peaceless one, who is angry at Mani. And then ultimately they tell the story of Mani being killed by Bahram. Now, the Manichaeans, and I'm going to talk about the religion, like their religious beliefs here in just a bit, but I mentioned that they were persecuted in Persia. Now, I also mentioned earlier that when they were persecuted, a big group of them went into the Roman Empire and another went into Asia. We'll just concentrate on the ones mostly that went into the Roman Empire. Sometime in the late 200s, either 296 or 298, you have an emperor named Diocletian, and he received a letter from the governor of Egypt saying that there were Manichaeans that were causing problems. And Diocletian issued an edict or a law that was against the Manichaeans. And what I'd like you to do is to stop the video and read through this particular edict. If you read through this, what you'll notice is that Diocletian doesn't seem to be so concerned about the religion itself. He was more concerned that they were coming from Persia. And you can see here from the Persian people, our enemy. He's thinking that when these Persian Manichaeans come over, that they're going to try and get the people of Egypt to really convert to a Persian religion, and maybe Diocletian thought they would ultimately leave and move to transfer Egypt into Persian hands, which of course didn't happen, and Diocletian was wrong about these people being Persians. But this is what he believed, and this started a whole series of persecutions, which really doesn't end until they start disappearing in the middle of the 400s. Okay, I mentioned we've got quite a few Manichaean texts, and this is just a very small list. You've got the Manichaean Psalm Book, written in Coptic. You've got the Kephaliah, written in Coptic again, the homilies in Coptic, and then you've got some of Mani's letters, which are just still being discovered today. There's a lot of work being done on these letters, at least the little bits that are left. So we have quite a few Manichaean texts that help us understand the religion a little bit better than from their detractors. Okay, a little bit about the religion itself. You've got the Manichaeans divided up into two basic groups. One are called the elect, and one are called the hearers. So the hearers are like the laity in Christianity. They're the people who are doing their everyday jobs, and they just happen to believe in Manichaeism. The elect are really the hierarchy. And I should say the elect here can be male and female. The female version would be electa. So what I've given you here is a table talking a little bit about the duties of the elect and the hearers. And what I'd like you to do is to stop the video and read through these things. Okay, and what you can see is what I put up here. There are 10 commandments for the elect. I've listed 5, but there are subcategories in here. And these are really the way that the Manichaeans should be living, the elect should be living. Telling the truth, don't harm anything, don't say anything bad, and then to live in poverty. And this gives a number of times they're supposed to be praying and celebrating Mani's death, which happened to be around Easter time, which corresponded with Christianity. You also have the hearers, or the catechumen, they're called, or the laity. So again, these are the commandments: do not lie, kill, and so on. They also had duties to pray. They had confessions that they made in front of the elect on Mondays. They also had a duty to feed the elect. Okay, in terms of the religion itself, Manichaeism is sometimes called the religion of the 2 principles and the 3 times. So these 2 principles are a good God and an evil God. And then you've got the 3 times, the beginning time, the middle time, and the end. And what I'm going to do in the next series of slides is sort of describe to you these 2 principles and the 3 times. What I've got here is, actually it's an overhead, so it's fairly old, and I've given this to many of my classes when I talk about Manichaeism. This is just describing these 3 time periods, the beginning, the middle, and the end, and these 2 natures, these 2, the good God and the evil God. According to Manichaeism, in the first period, you've got a total separation of the light and darkness, or of good and evil. I put here, just in a drawing, a border. If you look at some of the Manichaean texts, especially the anti-Manichaean texts that are coming from Augustine, who was a church father who lived in the late 300s, early 400s, he talks about a physical border that separates the 2, and that if you draw out what this looks like, you have the good, or the light, in the west, east, and the north, and then you've got the evil area in the south. So in this first period, you've got a total separation. You've got the good God, the Father of greatness, And then you have all these sort of sub-deities surrounding the Father of Greatness. So you've got the 12 aeons, which surround the Father of Greatness, and then surrounding them on the outside are 144 of these deities. You also have a description of what makes up the kingdom of light. You've got these 5 elements: air, wind, light, water, and fire. Now, if you look down below the border, you've got where the Prince of Darkness lives. And you've got a description, again, of what the area of darkness or the area of evil looks like. It's made up of smoke and wind and darkness, water and fire. So that's in the beginning of time. These things were totally separated. Now what I have here is a sort of a long description, and you don't need to worry too much about the details of this, describing how good and evil meet and what happens when they mix together. So you've got this second period. This is called the battle. And what I've got here, and I've tried to number this, and again, these details aren't totally important, but what starts this battle off is you've got the Prince of Darkness noticing something up above. He sees the light and he wants it. This caused a bit of a panic in the land of light. And so what you see is that the Father of Greatness emanates a whole bunch of these lower deities. So you've got the Mother of Life, and you've got the Primal Man. The Primal Man arms himself with his sons or with armor. Some of these texts say both. Now what happens here to prevent the Prince of Darkness from coming up into the land of light, they send out this deity. And so what happens is the Primal Man jumps into this battle. And then, as I put here, kapow, you've got the battle between the good and evil. Now what happens here, and you can skip down to this bottom, is that the Prince of Darkness actually grabs the Primal Man and swallows him, starts to swallow him. Now it looks like this is the end for this particular battle, and it looks like the Prince of Darkness is winning, but in reality this was a whole trick. So what happens is that the Primal Man yells out for help, and this is something called the call. Now what happens is more deities are emanated. You've got the Friend of Light, the Great Builder, and so on. And what happens towards the very end of this battle is you've got something called the Living Spirit and the Mother of Life, and they rescue the Primal Man. What they do is they reach down into the darkness with their right hand, and they pull the Primal Man out. Now what happens in the end is that his armor is left behind. So they pull him out, but they leave these 5 sons or 5 armors are left in the darkness. Now this was part of the trap. So what happened now is that within this evil area, which includes the earth and all things that are made out of matter, you've got particles of good. Now I'm hoping you remember what we talked about in terms of the Gnostics. So remember, the Gnostics believed that there was a spark, something good in all of matter, and that had to be sifted out. So this is exactly their story as well. You've got this armor or these bits of light that are left in material, and this is how people are saved. Now, if you look deeper into the way the Manichaeans saw creation and everything, you'll see that the earth was created by the good God out of the bodies of the demons after this battle is done. Now the human body acts as sort of a filter. It's created by the demons to trap the rest of the light, and that doesn't work. So what happens is, according to Manichaeism, you've got a savior who comes down, and this is Jesus, and he's sent to rescue the light. So he teaches the light, or teaches people how to escape all of this and send the light back to the good God. Now in the end, I should have put a slide up here. In the end, what you've got is all of the light is taken from this world, taken back into the kingdom of heaven, and then according to some Manichaean texts, the evil part is just buried and it's forgotten forever. So in the end, the good will win out. Now you're probably wondering why this is a Christian religion. Well, if you look deeper than what I've been telling you, if you read any of the Manichaean material, it sounds very Christian. There's talk of Jesus, of God, the Holy Spirit, Mani as an apostle teaching everything. Now, again, we've got tons of texts. I've already talked about some of the material we have. Some really interesting stuff that's been coming out since the 1990s is from a town called Kelis in Egypt. There they've discovered lots of Manichaean letters in houses that were written by these Manichaeans, and many of them are women. Many of these writers are women. And as I put up here, new material is coming out all the time. Some of my colleagues go to Dublin, Ireland every single year, and they're working on a brand new text, another part of the Kephaliah that hasn't been translated yet. So they just published a book on it in December 2015, and everyone in my area, we're just waiting for that translation to come out. I'd mentioned that the Manichaeans spread west into the Roman Empire. They also went east into Asia. What you're looking at here is a drawing which looks like the Buddha, and it's found in the province of Fujian on the eastern part of China, right on the Pacific. And it looks like a Buddhist temple, and people, as you can see here, are still coming to this particular temple, and they're making their offerings. What they don't realize is that this image here is of Mani, dressed as the Buddha. So I'd mentioned that Manichaeism was really good about taking the local religions and adopting it, and this is exactly what happened here.
Whoa! Wow, that was interesting. I learned something. But so to the both of you who are watching, this story of Manichaeism is more plausible to me than to the Orthodox Christianity that finally emerged out of the Roman Empire. In fact, I'm willing to go out on a limb and say that every form of Christianity that we're going to come across through the 300 years before the Council of Nicaea, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that all of them will make more sense and be more plausible than what finally was decided on as orthodoxy. That's my prediction. I was actually going to just decide that let's open up the room and have a talk about this now, but now I'm really into this. I've got some real interest. So I'm going to continue because no one has come in the room, which is probably a good thing, because now I can continue. Okay, so now what we'll do is we're going to go over to Yale. Okay, before we do that, let me just give you the my axioms. My axioms are all gods are imaginary, and human evolution is proven by science. Those are two subjects that are non-debatable and are axiomatic. To refresh your memory of tonight's program, we are looking at early Christianity, women in the early church. We've discussed Manichaeism is what we're on right now, and then an open discussion or another Yale talk to follow the one we're about to watch. All of that is open for pretty much a discussion at this point. Hearing no dissension, I introduce and before I actually introduce it, before we actually click the run button on this, it's entitled St. Augustine's Confessions. So St. Augustine, when I see the saint, it kind of says to me that this is something to do with Catholics. So I've watched quite a few of this professor's lectures in this course, and I haven't watched this. I've probably watched this one, but I don't remember it specifically. So I'm going to look forward to this lecture, and I hope you do too.
You may be asking yourself, why are we reading the Confessions? I think I gave a preliminary answer before, but since it seems to be perhaps more appropriate for religious studies or philosophy, let me remind you why we're struggling through this. First, the impact of Christianity on the Roman Empire, that is to say, the sort of social and intellectual setting of the rise of Christianity in the late 4th, early 5th centuries. The second is to understand some of the Christian moral and doctrinal problems and their implications. Once again, we're not exactly interested in these for reasons of theology or morality, but we need to get into the minds of people at the time in order to understand what bothered them, what controversies they were involved in, and how those controversies indeed divided the Roman Empire and the successors to the Roman Empire. Some of those problems, well, under the, that second heading of Christian moral and doctrinal problems, let me just mention three, which by no means exhausts them, but are three that we can sort of, if not identify with, I think see their importance. One, the problem of evil. Second, the relation between body and soul. And three, the Christian understanding of sin and redemption. Now, it turns out these are all aspects of the same problem. And they are dealt with in Augustine's works most thoroughly, more thoroughly than any other thinker of the ancient world. The third reason we're looking at this is the interaction between Christianity and classical culture and religion. Roman life and politics, Augustine's career and his giving up his career, what that means, other ideas within the Roman Empire, such as Manichaeism, Platonism. And then finally, this is a document of philosophical and psychological investigation. And while that is not our primary purpose here, you should not get out of a liberal arts college program without reading this and pondering it a little. This can be summarized in terms of the importance of the humanities even, or of philosophical investigation as opposed to mere investigation of natural phenomena, in words that Augustine uses in Book 10, which we have not read. After Book 9, Book 10 is a turning. It discusses time and the meaning of time. Books 11, 12, and 13 are a commentary on Genesis. Worth reading, if you like, and interesting to think about how they do or do not mesh with the more confessional parts of the confession. But in Book 10 he says, men go out and gaze in astonishment at high mountains, the huge waves of the sea, the broad reaches of rivers, the ocean that encircles the world, or the stars in their courses, but they pay no attention to themselves. They are busy looking at external phenomena and not examining their own heart. And if the Confessions is anything, it is certainly an examination of the author's heart. But it's not an examination of his heart in a purely emotional sense, in the way we're familiar with in so-called confessional literature. I had a tough upbringing, this happened to me, that happened to me. I struggled with addiction. I, beat my kids. Now I'm a great person. Whatever. This is an intellectual investigation as well as an emotional investigation. And indeed, Augustine doesn't see these as separate, or to the degree that he does, it's in a more complicated way than just saying intellectual versus non-intellectual. He is an intellectual, obviously. And he awakened to being an intellectual, an experience that many of you may have had. Remember, he reads this dialogue by Cicero, now lost, called the Hortensius. And this convinces him that the life of the mind is the most important thing to pursue. And I wouldn't say that we all have had this experience, but maybe what was the point at which you discovered that you weren't like other people? That they lived more for immediate sensations or pleasure, or what Augustine would call debauchery. And you wanted to read or think about stuff or, do lab experiments. I think the essence of Yale, if I understand it correctly, is I don't have to choose between fun and the intellectual life. But, so it's not actually perhaps relevant to your lives now, but particularly if you went to a public high school, grew up in a non-intellectual environment, those of you whose parents or professors went to some school where, everybody was reading Latin at the age of 6. I'm not talking to you, but I'm talking to the vast majority who woke up one day and realized, either with pride or with dismay, I'm different from other people. Ideas have meaning to me. I'm going to suffer in life for that, though there are going to be some rewards. And I leave you to discern what the rewards are and to mull over what the suffering has been, or maybe will continue to be. I hope not. And I suspect you'll have an easier time of it. But this book is about a search for truth, and a search that takes a number of wrong turns, at least from Augustine's opinion, looking back on the situation when he wrote this in the 390s. It's a confession of sin. It's also, as I said before, a confession of praise for the God whose love directed him back to the right path. It is personal but exemplary. It is about spiritual yearning, but it is also about intellectual yearning for truth. It's a book about the education of a young man and the adventures of this young man and what he learns from them. Now, in the first place, he is both an intellectual and a passionate person. He is someone who is unusually frank about his desires. But notice that he's not just opposed to desire. He is not someone who believes that desire, love are to be simply repressed or ignored. Love is a psychological need, and he has a very discerning and interesting passage in describing his teenage years and his lusts when he frequented the brothels of Carthage. In Book 3, at the beginning, he says, I was in love with the idea of love. So he was not only in love, but he was in love with the idea of being an emotional being, of love that is both sexual and spiritual, in which these two things are not well marked off from each other. He is also a believer in friendship. And it's funny because in our own culture, I think friendship has changed. When I started teaching, people had trouble dealing with the affection that he has for his friends, like Alypius and Nebridius, or the mysterious unnamed friend who dies after being baptized. Augustine is always surrounded by friends. Even in the most intimate moments when he's undergoing this conversion, there are all sorts of people right around him. And as I said before, this seemed to be, I mean, the explanation was, well, he must have been homosexual, or he must have these desires, or maybe it's part of Roman culture of friendship. But in recent decades or years, where we have a culture of friendship, where your friends are extremely important, admittedly, if you have 900 of them, it's a little bit perhaps weakened, but I think we can understand some of this better than might have been the case a little while ago. This friend who dies after being baptized, here is an example of another form of seriousness. They go out and have fun together, the friend becomes ill, the friend is suddenly very serious. The friend gets baptized because to be baptized, as with Constantine, means that you are committing yourself to a much more stringent and moral life than before. And then he dies. And this certainly disturbs Augustine. What is life all about? And any of you who've had the experience of contemporaries of yours who have died will understand this, I think. Augustine is also ambitious. He is a successful person, even though he's from a modest family. His father, a pagan or non-Christian middle-class official of North Africa, his mother a Christian. He's clearly marked for success because of his unusual gifts. His unusual gifts being intellectual, ability to write, ability to argue. He's marked out as extremely smart. And at that time, success for such a person, the course of success was through government service. This is the era of post-Diocletian, post-Constantine. And related particularly to a combination of rhetoric and law. This is not all that different from societies familiar to us. That is to say, the training in law gives one access to a number of different kinds of political offices, but rhetoric is perhaps a little stranger to us. Rhetoric in this context means the art of persuasion, so it's very closely related to law and legal pleading. It is the art of writing well, of writing elegantly, and it is very, very highly valued in the Roman Empire. His mother, Monica, is extremely pious. In fact, the first class that I taught, no, I guess I was a section leader. Right, when I was a graduate student, the first section I had, my students were arguing with me about Augustine's patronizing attitude towards his mother. And I said, well, no, he's not patronizing. I mean, he's smarter than his mother. And his mother's just an ordinary person. After all, Augustine becomes a saint and his mother doesn't. And, a guy from Santa Monica Catholic school said, who do you think Santa Monica is? This is Augustine's mother. So anyway, I've learned. Augustine's mother is a saint. She is a more steadfast kind of person than Augustine. She's not someone who stays up all night wrestling with the problem of evil. Nevertheless, she does not want him to be baptized. She wants him to be successful. Like most mothers, she wants her child to be a good person, but even more than that, she wants her child to be a success. And that means delaying baptism, because if he's going to be a success, he's going to have to be involved in the world of high government, and that may mean, well, that definitely means involvement in sinfulness, involvement in the shedding of blood, involvement in legal wrangling and stuff like that. And so he is encouraged to lead a normal life, normal in meaning, at least in his own retrospective view, sinful life. This is what Augustine is giving up in his conversion. He is giving up a career. He is giving up a social expectation of success or social definition of success. He is giving up the pleasures attendant on that career, which range from parties to honors to sexual conquests and the whole life of a well-established member of the Roman elite. What is bothering Augustine? What bothers him is, in part, the problem of evil, which we've alluded to already. Why does a good and omnipotent God allow evil to flourish? A related problem is that compared to the works of the Greek writers and philosophers, the Bible seems awfully crude to him, rhetorically in terms of style, and conceptually in terms of its ideas. The Old Testament God, and we're probably at various levels of familiarity with the Old Testament, but the Old Testament God is temperamental, I think it's fair to say. Here's a guy who decides to destroy, a deity who decides to destroy the world by flood, destroys the cities of the plain, kills one of the people bearing the tabernacle back to Jerusalem because he stumbles. What kind of God is this? This bothers Augustine, and his anthropomorphism bothers Augustine. In the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, God speaks with people. Adam hears him walking in the garden. How can that be? How can this human-seeming God be the real God? So these two anxieties put Augustine in the camp of the Manichaeans. Remember, the Manichaeans believe that the solution to the problem of evil is that God is not omnipotent. God is trying, but there's another evil God who is opposing him. And that evil God is the God of the flesh and the God of the Old Testament, Jehovah, the Creator God, the God of matter and flesh. We are souls imprisoned in flesh. Our true home is the spiritual, and we have to renounce everything that has to do with the flesh in order to go there. So Manichaeism would seem to be extremely ascetic. You should have absolutely nothing to do with the world. But as is always the case with the statement, everything that's material is evil, but we are material, Manichaeism also offers or affords you an opportunity to be completely involved in the world, totally involved in the world, because there's nothing you can do about it. All you can do is say, the flesh is evil, I'm in the flesh, I'm just have to deal with it until I am liberated into the spirit. So Manichaeism is not necessarily world-renouncing, but they do identify the source of evil with the body. The body is wicked, the immaterial soul is good. This is not Christianity, as Augustine discovers or elaborates. Even though we may think of Christianity as exalting the soul over the body, nevertheless, it also exalts the body. The Christian doctrine is that the bodies of human beings will be resurrected, not just the souls. There will be bodies after the last judgment in heaven and in hell. God created the world and it was good. What then explains the presence of evil? Augustine at this stage turns to Platonism for an understanding of the nature of evil. Evil is not a thing in itself. It is rather the absence of good. Now, if anyone has ever said that to you, you will have found that unconvincing, at least in its first iteration. Because we're not just talking about the absence of good as in this bowl of chili is not very good. It's not very flavorful. It's okay, but it's kind of lacking in something. But that's not evil. Evil is not kind of like not particularly good. Evil is much more vivid, gratuitous, cruel, all-encompassing. The Platonists don't deny that. What they mean by saying it's the privation of good is that it is nothingness. Evil is, in fact, the absence of being and meaning. The reason it produces such spectacular effects as war, oppression, crime, is that people turn away from the good, or they turn away from what is truly good to prefer lower goods. They turn away from the things of the spirit to the things of the flesh. They prefer their own lusts and desires, their own ambitions and greed to the common good or to the immaterial and spiritual good. And it's this turning away from the sun, it's turning away from good, that seems to be a human problem. Human beings, generally speaking, don't understand what they're on earth for, according to the Platonists. Many of you are familiar with the metaphor of the cave from the Republic. This is the classic depiction of this wrong preference. The people in the cave are chained facing the back wall of the cave, and they see images of what's passing in front of the cave reflected on the wall. As time goes on, they come to believe that those images are reality. They forget that they're chained. They forget that they can't see the real things. They forget the sun. If you were to liberate them and turn them around and show them the light, first of all, they couldn't bear it because they're used to the world of shadow. Secondly, they'd kill you because you are destroying their assumptions and their world. They would at least persecute you. They're not interested in the truth, they're interested in getting by. So for the Platonists, evil is the result of this error in perception, assuming that it's a great thing to get rich, or assuming that it's a great thing to beat people up because you're stronger than they are, or it's a great thing to conquer and subjugate, or all of these things, some of which are evil but are really the preference of things that you should not be pursuing, or that you should be pursuing for reasons inspired by spiritual truth. How do you get rid of this? In the Platonist imagination, by education. That's the whole point of Plato's dialogues. That's why they are dialogues, many of them, with a kind of question and answer. They're very didactic. They're like being in a class. Socrates quizzes people, and then he shows the solution, and they say, "Oh, wow, Socrates, now I understand. Now I'm going to be a Platonist, and I'm going to build a perfect society." End of story. The important thing to understand about Platonism is that it is not dualist in the way that Manichaeism is, or the way that we sort of instinctively think about evil. Evil is not opposed to good. It's hierarchically inferior to good. The Platonist universe is like a ladder with many rungs, going up from mud, bugs, rocks, to the immaterial one. And with many, many steps, as I said, many rungs or steps or levels in between. Human beings are kind of in the middle, and also human beings, unlike animals, mud, slugs, but also unlike angels and demiurges and deities, human beings can move up and down the ladder. That's what free will is. That's what being human is. You can read Hortensius, read the Confessions, fall in love with the liberal arts and descend to some very high realm of the spirit. Or, you can choose to the downward path to debauchery and mere pleasure. It's a question of how free you are, but we do have the opportunity to move up and down this ladder, unlike the animals and all other created forces that are fixed. Now, the question is, what makes us move up and down this, or what will motivate us to move up? And here we come to some key differences between Platonism and Christianity with regard to evil. Platonism tends to ascribe evil to ignorance. Christianity tends to ascribe evil to sin. The difference between sin and ignorance is that sin is deliberate. You know you shouldn't do this, and you do it anyway. You're not overcome by desire. So, to anticipate one of the paper topics, but I don't think I'm going to be giving away the answer, what is it about the pear stealing incident that makes it so important? Anybody want to venture a preliminary response to this?
Well, it's the fact that he doesn't need the pears. And there's the fact that he just does it because he feels like sinning. He has a desire for evil.
So the pears, he doesn't need the pears. It is just a desire. I mean, he doesn't say to himself, I want to sin. I haven't sinned in 2 days. He doesn't need the pears. What do they do with the pears when they get them? Yeah, they throw them out. They throw them to the pigs. So they're not hungry. It's not like I was overcome by desire, and that led me into some sort of sinful behavior. They weren't overcome by desire at all. How would you describe their pre-pear stealing state? I mean, at least, what would you guess was their pre-pear stealing frame of mind? There's one word that'll describe it, but if you want to use a few more. Some guys go and they steal some pears from an orchard. They fool around with them. They throw them to the pigs. Bored. Bored. Now, here's something we can identify with. They're bored. They need to amuse themselves. They cannot amuse themselves by saying, I'm a good person, or I'm going to contemplate the one, or I'm going to do some homework. Right? It doesn't end. Young people are thought to be easily bored, but the boredom of old people is it's a different kind of boredom, but there it is. It's persistent. That's not the only reason people sin, but it is a gratuitous reason, and that's what's interesting about the pears. It's gratuitous. It's not from need. The Platonists don't have a good response to why this happens, because it's not a question of education. Now, Augustine does not invent Christian ideas of sin. If you said to Augustine, oh, come on, why are you so worried about the pears? He's not worried about the pears as such. It's just a little emblem or a little example of a different kind of problem. That is to say, knowing how to behave doesn't change us. Feeling how to behave. To put it in Freudian terms, it's not the ego that decides, it's the id. It's the instinct, not the intellect. And that's what his conversion means. His conversion is not suddenly, I was convinced that Christianity was true. He already knows that Christianity is true, but he knows it intellectually. The conversion is a conversion to an emotional apprehension of it. So however intellectual he may seem to you, however formed in the tradition of Greco-Roman classicism he was, however much the Hortensius awakened him to the life of the mind, he is ultimately a theologian and philosopher of the irrational, of the supra-rational. And indeed, Christianity, in its history, has an oscillation between intellectualization and the rediscovery of sin and God's grace. If you think of movements like the Reformation of Martin Luther, John Calvin, etc., in the 16th century, it takes issue with the notion that we can do works that give us merit in the sight of God, and that the church tells us we have accumulated merits and therefore will go to heaven. The Reformation teaches that we are face to face with God and that our so-called good deeds don't amount to anything. We are all sinful. If God operated according to justice, we would all go to hell. Faith and grace that save people, hence the Reformation. But it's also the Great Awakening of Britain and America in the 18th century, the development of Methodism, the fundamentalist movement. All of these tend to reject attempts to approach God contractually, attempts to approach God in terms of a deal. So, if human beings are sinful, and if education is not going to get them out of sin, what will? Now, the Augustine of the Confessions is different than the Augustine of 20 years later when he wrote The City of God. And we're not studying the City of God, but this book, written in response to the sack of Rome in 410, develops some ideas that are found in the Confessions about the nature of sin and how we get out of it. The nature of sin is the pairs. How we get out of it is, at least in part, the conversion. We got the pairs sufficiently for the time being? The conversion is started, well, it started long before the event. But what precipitates it as a drama is this conversation with Pontitianus in Book 8, Part 8, who has traveled and describes the monks of Egypt. Now, we'll be talking lots and lots about monks, but the monks of Egypt are the first example of Christian monks, men who flee the world into the desert. And there, live on, weeds, saline water, locusts, other insects, basically nothing. And they have visions, and they are sought out by ordinary people. It's key to understand that to be a hermit in this society does not necessarily mean that you have nothing to do with people. People start to want to find you because you must have special power. Back in Alexandria, their baby is sick. Maybe you, oh hermit living on locusts and out in the desert, have some spiritual power to help my baby. This is shamanism. It happens in all sorts of religions. You can't just be a shaman, a medicine man, a wise man, and hold down a regular old job. Or you can, but it helps, and that's the conceit of a lot of TV ideas, secret heroes. They're real estate agents, but they're battling the forces of darkness. But generally, most of the time, you've got to be special, and you've got to look special. And you've got to be a reject. You can't have a spouse, kids, a mortgage, a garden, a swing set. You've got to be a seer. You've got to have your vision focused on the other world. Pontitianus tells Augustine about these men, and his response is not only to be impressed by them, but to be humiliated by them. First of all, here are these guys who are intoxicated with God while I'm still thinking about my career. But, and this is the ancient world speaking, they are uneducated, these monks of Egypt. They didn't study the Republic, the Hortensius, the Timaeus, the rhetoric of Quintilian, the satires of Juvenal. They don't know anything about this. They're uneducated people. Many of them are illiterate. And yet, they are closer to God. They have an apprehension of the divine that causes them to renounce the world. Whereas we, Augustine says of him and his circle, we lie here groveling in this world of flesh and blood while they storm the gates of heaven. And this is the moment of his conversion. Now, after his conversion, Augustine's plan was to lead a life of contemplation with his friends. They would retreat from the world, meaning they would give up their careers, but it would be a little bit like you and your friends, one of your friends' parents have a lot of money and have this wonderful cabin somewhere in the Rockies or the Sawtooth Mountains, and you're going to figure out some kind of way of, you'll be on the internet and everything, but you're going to have this kind of beautiful contemplative life. But the beautiful part is that it's not going to be uncomfortable. It's not the desert of Egypt. It's remote. You're not going to be bothered, but they're beautiful mountains, trouts in the stream. It's a sort of idyllic. And you and your friends are going to talk about reality and the spirit and philosophy. And I don't know how idyllic this sounds to you, but it's certainly an understandable idea of a way of life. It is the ancient idea of what's called leisure with dignity. And indeed, that's what being a professor was supposed to be when I signed up for it. Otium cum dignitate, leisure with dignity. Leisure meaning not, wasting time leisure, but not responding to clients or not responding to, urgent scheduling, phone calls, deals. You've got to show up to your classes, right? But that's not really onerous. At least that was the idea. I won't go into the frustrations of being a professor or the dissatisfactions. But the classical ideal is otium cum dignitate. Dignity meaning not being naked in the desert, not having to, eat locusts and figure out how to, okay, I had curried locusts last night. Tonight I think I'll have, locust casserole. No, something nicer than that. But in fact, he did not follow through on this. He did not lead a life of cultivated classical dignity with his friends. He went back to North Africa. He became a bishop. His years were consumed by disputes over doctrine, or with heretical, as he deemed them, tendencies, like Donatism, most notably. And he died defending his city of Hippo Regius, in modern Tunisia, from the Vandals, one of those barbarian invaders who will occupy us next week. He then was very much involved in the world. To be a bishop in the Roman Empire was by no means an office of dignified leisure. It was right in there in the political trenches. It's a position of honor, to be sure, but his understanding of the Christian's duty in the world was that you cannot lead a life of perfection. You cannot lead a life of sin-free contemplation. We all are sinners. He becomes more and more the theologian, philosopher who combats perfectionism. Perfectionism is a doctrine that human beings can be made radically better, perfect even. There are debates throughout societies about the degree of human perfectibility. This is indeed supposedly, and to some extent I think really at the heart of debates between what is called liberalism in the United States and conservatism. Liberals believe in human perfectibility. If you educate people, if you help them, if you encourage them, if you provide government subsidies, you will build a better society. The response upon the part of conservatives to that is people are the way they are because that's the way they want to be, or they made wrong choices, but all the help from some public authority isn't going to help, isn't going to really make a difference. Are people perfectible? People who believe in education tend to believe that they are. On the other hand, very well-educated people have been bad. Hitler loved classical music. So did Stalin. Just because you are a connoisseur of art doesn't make you a good person. Augustine is a radical imperfectionist, more so in the City of God than in the Confessions, which is sort of teetering on the brink. The Pears as a kind of imperfectionist moment. It sort of glimpses the power of sin. By the time of the City of God, by the time that the end of the Roman Empire is at least glimpsed as a possibility and the rise of the barbarians, Augustine has become someone who does not believe that human beings can in any way earn salvation. Human beings are irrevocably sinful. Once again, if God judged people according to their merits, they would all be damned. Since the Christian belief is that some people are saved, they're saved by a mysterious process called grace. Grace, by its very meaning, is undeserved. You don't show up at the door of heaven with a ticket of admission earned by your deeds on earth. What opens the doors to you is a generous, arbitrary decision. Well, generous may mean I had good intentions. I didn't kill anybody. But arbitrary may mean that we can't figure out who's going to heaven and who's going to hell. It may even mean that God, since God knew before we were born, God predestined us for heaven or hell. This is a harsh doctrine. It gets periodically rediscovered and then dropped. It's at the heart of the belief of the people who settled Massachusetts and Connecticut. It is the heart of Calvinism and of Puritanism, the belief in the elect. The question is, are these elect visible or invisible? The elect are people who are going to go to heaven. Are they visible? Can we say, this guy is so good, he's going to heaven? This woman is so loving, nurturing, self-effacing, whatever, she's going to go to heaven. That's a notion of a visible elect. An invisible elect is, we don't know. We have no idea. And this is a crucial difference, because if you believe in the visible elect, even if you say they're not guaranteed, but anybody outside of this circle is for sure going to hell, then you have Puritan New England. You have a small community of people pursuing perfection. Or you have the Amish. Or you have any small pious community that believes that outside of it is more or less given over to sin and more or less doomed. Inside of it, maybe it's not guaranteed, but your chances are much, much better. But if you believe that we don't have a visible elect, that we have no idea, then everybody ought to be in the church. Everybody ought to have access to the sacraments that provide initiation into the church. You ought to start converting pagans, even savage pagans. You ought to be out there roping in as many people into the church, including people who don't want to be. Because you just never know. Maybe their kids will be. Augustine is behind ideas of things like forced conversion. As long as they're baptized, there's a chance of them being saved. and baptized as infants, preferably. Because baptism does not any longer mean, in Augustine's world, perfection. It means the beginning. It means entering the process. So the three things that he is teaching that are implicit in the confessions and that he is important for in terms of his intellectual impact are his opposition to perfectionism, his exaltation of grace, and the notion of sin as indelible, not solvable. Where this becomes of key historical importance is in the church. The church is a body that can either be sectarian and small, as with the Amish, or Puritan New England, or it can be huge and universal, as with the medieval Catholic Church. Augustine stands behind the medieval Catholic Church, which is a political body, a body of doctrine, a structure ruled by princes, and a structure that has a missionary impact on the rest of the world. Now, the papers, you have the paper topics. If you didn't get them, come up and see me after. You can choose any one of them, or you can choose something else. But if you choose something else, please talk to your teaching fellow or to me.
Wow, that is fascinating stuff. All right, I thoroughly enjoyed that. I also, again, I was going to urge the discussion room and stuff open, but there's really not enough people watching for that to happen. However, on the subjects that we're talking about, for example, in early Christianity, we were discussing women, Manichaeism, and the historical Jesus is going to be coming up next, I think, because no, I got a better idea. I have a better idea. I think what we'll do is we'll keep on the topic. Yes, we'll keep to the topic of women in the early church, and I will present a video, a lecture, just like this one we just watched, on exactly that. I think that makes more sense. I just have to what do I have to do here? I got too many things open. Credit. Okay, what I'll do is, instead of wasting time, I'm going to get it going and worry about the finer details later. Sorry for doing this to you, but such is the life. Okay, I'll take it away. It's called Women in Early Christianity, and it is by Jeremy F. Hulton, and I will credit him in one moment.
Everyone, and welcome to THE 507, Lecture 10b, where we look at the roles of women in the New Testament, passages about the roles of women, instances from the Gospels and other stories which illustrate what women did, how they were involved, and also passages, especially in the epistles, which sometimes specify rules for women, and so on. As you will all be well aware, the roles of women were controversial in the ancient world just as they are today. So we begin our survey by thinking about roles of women in the ancient world more broadly, so that we can put the New Testament passages and Jesus' interaction with women, or Paul's comments in his letters, so that we can put those into a bit more context and have some sense of where they were typical, where they were atypical. It is very hard in short compass to give a balanced presentation of the question of how women were viewed and what roles they had in the ancient world. So please bear with me as I summarize, and bear in mind there are exceptions to everything I say here, and we could devote a whole semester easily to just the roles of women in the ancient world, and we could explore each of these issues in great detail. But we've got to get to the New Testament, and so we've got to survey things sort of briskly. And we can start with the unhappy fact that in the ancient world, broadly speaking, women were not viewed positively. Again, we will give exceptions, but this is overwhelmingly true. And we almost have to put out of our minds what I think most of us have today as an inherent sense of the equality of the sexes. Ancients just did not share that assumption. Even at the level of biology, at the level of psychology, however you want to look at it, they assumed women were inferior versions of the human. For a famous passage from Plato, and this prayer is also sometimes ascribed to other ancient Greek philosophers, Socrates or Thales. Lots of sources say Plato used to pray to God, God, I thank you that you made me a Greek, not a barbarian, that you made me free and not a slave, and that you made me a man and not a woman. Now, in some ways we think of early Christianity as taking shape in two cultural contexts, that of the Greco-Roman world more broadly, but also of a subculture, of a special religion, that is, of Judaism. So, how can we contrast this view of Plato with the prayer of, let's say, Rabbi Judah? Rabbi Judah's prayer, as recorded in a few different early rabbinic sources, says, God, I thank you that you made me a Jew, not a Gentile, free, not a slave, and a man, not a woman. You can see that all that has changed is the cultural valence of being Greek. And for Rabbi Judah, what's culturally valuable, religiously valuable, is that he's a Jew, not a Gentile. Whereas for Plato, it was a Greek, not a barbarian. Both agree it's good to be free, not slave. Both agree it's good to be man, not woman. And if we flesh this out a bit more, the truth is we would see that the same sorts of opinions we have here are echoed and amplified, perhaps, throughout the whole Hellenistic tradition. And so, for instance, Aristotle, who writes important treatises on friendship, goes out of his way to make clear you can't really have friendship between men and women. So if you've seen the movie When Harry Met Sally, they take up this topic. And in Harry Met Sally, they conclude men and women can't ever really be friends because some sort of romantic attraction will inevitably rear its head. That's not Aristotle's logic. Aristotle says there's no friendship between men and women. Why? Well, because women are so far inferior to men in their capacity for rationality, in their capacity for virtue, that it's just would be weird. It's friendship between unequals is inherently unstable and unsatisfying. It's not profitable. Again, that sort of attitude can be echoed by lots of Jewish voices from roughly the time of Jesus and early Christianity. So Philo of Alexandria, whom we've had occasion to quote at several times in this unit, really speaks quite negatively about women. And Philo, in his vast writings that have survived for us, it's almost unremittingly negative. Women are irrational and symbols of passion. That means emotion. They're governed by their emotions, their lustfulness. This is true of Greek and Roman texts as well. The Essenes gave up on marriage altogether because why? Women just can't be trusted to stick out their marriage vows. They're too governed by their lusts. Josephus and so on. I want to say a word of caution here, and I do want to give one of these exceptions I've mentioned. And here's my word of caution. It's one thing to not have a perfectly accurate view of the Greco-Roman world, and it's another to have an imperfect view of ancient Judaism for this reason. Christian scholars and Christian preachers have, unfortunately, often taken some ancient Jewish views let's say, negative about women as well as negative about other things, and have used this to paint ancient Judaism quite negatively. And this has contributed to Christian anti-Semitism. And so on the one hand, there's no way to say that Philo of Alexandria has a particularly happy view of women. But we want to be really cautious about contrasting Christian roles for women and views of women with Jewish ones, if in any way that plays into anti-Semitism. So to illustrate this, we'll just give an example of one of the sayings from an early rabbinic text, the Mishnah, which can be quoted to illustrate what a terrible view the rabbis had of women. And this is a quotation: "Every man who teaches his daughter Torah is as if he taught her promiscuity." You know what? You might as well teach her to be a prostitute so soon as you teach her to read the Bible. And this sort of thing can be quoted out of context as if this is the only view the rabbis held, whereas in fact, this very passage from the Mishnah, the preceding quotation, is a different view. Ben Azai says, a man ought to give his daughter a knowledge of Torah. And furthermore, there are a couple, not enough, but a couple famous women sages like Bruria, married to Rabbi Meir, who in various traditions is this courageous rabbinic sage who engages in halakhic dispute and corrects a couple of the rabbi's views, and so on and so forth. So there are exceptions, and we don't want to caricature. In particular, we don't want to caricature a Jewish view of women in the ancient world. That said, it's useful to restate that ancients really thought women weren't fully human. And we could draw a sort of chart which would say on the upper end, there are free adult male citizens of high social standing. They have proper minds and they can govern their passions. They can think rationally. They're fully formed humans. And on the other end there's a couple ways to be lower on this scale. It's to be female, that's lower, but female but free. Or to be a male, but to be a slave. Or to be a male, but to be sexually passive. Or to be a eunuch, or to be a child. In different ways, all of these different categories are contrasted in ancient Greek and Roman texts with being a free adult male. And what you find on this lower end of the scale is people who just can't think straight, who are governed by their passions. And so Aristotle will even say, a slave and a female and a child, what they broadly have in common is that the deliberative part of their mind, the part that can reason and make decisions, is simply not there in one way or another. A slave doesn't have it at all, he thinks. Females have it, yeah, but not without control. Children have it, but they don't really have control over it. So, there we have sort of a backdrop against which we can think about ways Jesus and the early Christians interacted with women, roles women played in early Christianity. One of the striking things about early Christianity is the sheer prominence of women, both in Jesus' ministry and in the earliest movement more broadly. It's often been remarked by historians of the ancient world that there is no known movement in which women played such diverse and such active roles. For what it's worth, it's interesting to note that the closest that any other movement attests is that of the Epicureans. Epicurus actually did hold that friendship between men and women was possible, and women in Epicurean communities were given a bit more authority and a bit more prominent roles. But in the New Testament, we will look at some of these passages more closely. We just note here that Jesus has women among his followers. There are women in prominent points in his life, so they alone come to witness his crucifixion. They are the first ones to be witnesses of the resurrection. That's really striking. And there are these famous episodes and stories. So here we have an artistic illustration of Jesus and the woman caught in adultery. But of course, that's just one of many, the Samaritan woman, the stories of Mary Magdalene, and these stories multiply and expand. we can look at, taken almost at random, a passage from the Apostle Paul. And Paul is often viewed as a bad guy when it comes to women. We'll look at some of those passages later. But here we just note at the end of Romans, where Paul has this really long meet and greet. So-and-so says hi, so-and-so says hi, please greet so-and-so. There's a ton of names. And among the things that's interesting is how many of these names are the names of women. Phoebe, Prisca, Mary, Junia, Tryphena, Tryphosa, Rufus, his mother, a mother also to me, Julia, his sister, so on and so forth. This is really prominent. That's a lot of women, and including women in leading roles. Now, arguably, what gave them this, the theological basis for this sort of role, would be a passage like we get in Galatians 3:28. And this is another passage that we're going to revisit and look at more closely. But there is no Jew nor Greek. There is no slave nor free. There is no male and female. Now just notice that the same sort of dichotomy that we had in the prayer of Plato or the early rabbinic prayer, it looks like all three dichotomies are overcome. You don't say, I'm glad I'm a Jew, not a Greek. I'm glad I'm a slave, not free, not a slave. I'm glad I'm male, not female. That's all done away with in Christ. There's a new basis for equality. You could argue that the basis for that is a reading of Genesis which accepts that men and women are alike created in the image of God. The creation story from Genesis is going to come up later, where it's used to insist that women must not be teachers because Eve was deceived. But it's important to emphasize that in the very first account of the creation of humankind, God says, let us make Adam, mankind. Not just Adam, but this is a common noun for humankind. Let us make Adam in our image. Let them have dominion. That is, Adam is not just Adam, the guy. It's not that Adam gets dominion. And the verse continues, so God created Adam in his image. Does that mean just the guy Adam? No, it means humankind. You can tell that because of the next sentence. In the image of God, God created them. Male and female, he created them. In other words, in this verse at least, it's not true for Genesis 2, but in this verse, Adam is not one of the two folk. Adam is humankind, and male and female are both Adam. Both are equally in the image of God. Now again, to be fair, in Genesis 2, Isha, woman, comes out of Ish, man. And there is a sense that man is created and woman is extracted from him. We'll get to that in a while. So we have here sort of an exegetical basis for the idea that God made this strangely diverse, sexually bimorphic humanity in God's own image. And that means there's a place of perhaps equality for women. I just want to explore a moment more some of these roles that Paul ascribes to women. Because before we get to Paul perhaps curtailing the roles of women, it's important to see what roles women played. So because Paul's letters are technically our earliest evidence, because they're written before the Gospels are written, we'll start with them. And we have to move briskly because there is a lot to cover. But we'll just note that, for instance, he starts by speaking about Phoebe in Romans 16 and calling her a deacon of the church at Cenchreae. So Phoebe already has a leadership role. And in fact, elsewhere in Romans, Paul speaks of Christ as a deacon. So her role is rather dramatic. And elsewhere in Paul's letters, he can speak of bishops or overseers and deacons. Women were deacons in the early church. That's in Paul's letters. This is unquestionable. She's also, and this is important, Paul says she was a benefactor. And that word speaks to a lot of roles, but above all, it means Phoebe had certain financial resources which she brought to bear to foster the Christian community. And that's important because it dovetails with something we see from Jesus' ministry. I'll get to that momentarily. Women, especially in the later Hellenistic period and in the early Roman period, did have a measure of financial independence. This varied place to place. It wasn't always the same, but women could control their finances in some circumstances. And it's pretty clear that in early Christian communities and in early Jewish communities, women functioned as patrons. They were able to support a synagogue or a church. We will just note here that when Paul, in 1 Timothy, in the pastoral epistles, the rules for deacons would seem to probably have a more curtailed role for women. We don't want to get ahead of ourselves. Even more strikingly, Paul speaks about not just a woman who's a deacon, but a woman who's an apostle. So in Romans 16:7, he says, greet Andronicus and Junia. He's greeting lots of husband-wife pairs. Surely Junia is Andronicus's wife. He says, my kinsmen, they were prominent among the apostles. Now, this verse has led to an inordinate amount of debate because it has freaked out a lot of modern people to think, oh, there can't be a woman apostle. And so they've said, oh, maybe it's the name Junia. That would be a lot more comforting. I'm sorry, it's the name Junius, a man's name. But that doesn't really work for a detailed set of reasons we don't have time to get into here. So alternatively, people have said, well, what do we mean by apostles? And what is Junia's role? Fascinatingly, there is a passage in the Gospels where the 12 are with Jesus and there are 3 women singled out by name. Why? Well, it relates to what I was just speaking about, because they are patrons. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, the wife of Herod's steward Chuza, and Susanna, and many others. And know what they do here, who were providing for Jesus and the apostles out of their resources. Now that's a pretty neat verse. We'll say a bit more about it, but just note, it has been proposed that Junia is just the Greek, the Hellenized form of the name Joanna. That this woman whom Luke describes as supporting Jesus and the apostles is the one Paul names and says, wow, Junia was prominent among the apostles. Is this the same woman? Could be, and maybe not. It's certainly the case that many Jews had Greek equivalents of their Jewish name. So if their name was Johanna, they would take a similar sounding Greek name, like Junia. Because this verse has been so controversial, we'll just say a quick other note about it. It is sometimes claimed that when Paul says that Junia was prominent among the apostles, rest assured, there can't be no women apostles. Paul just means Junia was prominent in the eyes of the apostles. That's what the preposition among means. Alternatively, it can mean she was prominent among the apostles in the normal way we use that word, namely, she was one of them. And in fact, among the folks who were apostles, she was kind of a standout. And so was her husband, so was Andronicus. The philological argument, if you just look at the meaning of the words, it's pretty clear Paul's saying they are prominent among the apostles. They are counted among the apostles. Just to be responsible here, it's important to note that apostles, especially for Paul, he doesn't limit that word to the 12. Paul speaks of specially sent out messengers. Apostle just comes from the word that means to send out. He speaks of lots of people who are co-workers and messengers. So when he says that Junia is among the apostles, he really is naming a woman among apostles. That is the result of the best scholarship. But he's not saying she was one of the 12 apostles or something like that, because he uses this word a little more broadly. So that's just important to say. In any event, we shouldn't really be surprised that he names her as a leader among the early Christians, because again, Paul constantly names co-workers. And they were clearly He was clearly quite comfortable working with them, and he assumed that they would play all sorts of roles in early Christian gatherings. These can be quickly enumerated. The most prominent of these was probably that of prophet, of participating in the liturgy and prophecy and prayer. Now, prayer is familiar to people today in Christian liturgy, but it's hard to remember how central prophecy was. The early Christian movement was a movement of the Spirit. And whether it's 1 Thessalonians in Paul's letters or 1 John, all these early Christian texts presuppose that gatherings of believers will include prophetic utterances. And one of the traditional roles women played in Greco-Roman religion was that of prophet. The image here is of the Pythia. Whether it's the Pythia or the Sibyl, there had been oracular speakers for the gods from as old as there was Greek religion. So this is a well-defined role for women to play in religious movements, and it's certainly a role they played in Christian movements. We're going to look a little more closely at 1 Corinthians 11, where Paul gives some instructions for women prophets and what sort of hats they're supposed to wear. But first, we just want to note that he takes for granted women will prophesy in church. And we hear of other women prophets, including Philip's 4 daughters. They get only a brief mention in the book of Acts, but in fact, they were famous. And into the 2nd century, people knew where their tombs were, and they were people of significance, and I think quite likely significance that's been eclipsed for a couple of reasons. Various church leaders were eager to continue to sort of undermine the authority of prophecy, and especially women's roles in prophecy. And that has a lot to do with another prophetic movement called the Montanist movement, which I'll say a word about in a moment. But suffice it to say for now, this outpouring of the Spirit in Asia Minor was built around one man, Montanus, and 2 women, Priscilla and Maximilla. Let's look just a little bit more closely at 1 Corinthians 11, because this is a convoluted passage and a controversial passage. We can at least see what Paul's major points were, and we can glean something about the roles of women in early Christianity from looking at it. We will not clear up every mystery here, because so much ink has been spilled on this passage without any real clear resolution as to its meaning. Paul's writing the Corinthians about various issues, and he gets to the question of order in their gatherings. And he says, I want you to understand that women need to have something on their head when they prophesy and pray. That's the upshot. But the way he establishes this is a little convoluted, and he makes arguments of a couple different types. First, he says, I want you to understand, Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of every woman. And therefore, if a man prays with something on his head, he disgraces his head. Presumably that means he disgraces Christ. If a woman prays without something on her head, she disgraces her head. Presumably that means her husband. And then he adds, oh, by the way, God is the head of Christ. The upshot is women need to have something on their head when they pray or prophesy. There are a couple non sequiturs there, I think, and I don't want to sound too critical of the Apostle Paul, but it's not quite clear why man is more the head of woman than Christ is of man and woman together, or what any of this has to do with having a piece of clothing or hair on your head. Part of the problem with this whole passage, one of the challenges, is that the expressions Paul uses for having something on the head are not entirely clear. It's not clear if he means wearing a veil, or if he means having the hair, woman's hairstyle, having the hair bound up or let down. Furthermore, it's not quite clear what was the norm in Corinth at this time for Jews or for Greeks and Romans. In different times and places, there were definitely specific kind of rules or policies. So for certain religious cults, men either did or didn't cover their heads when they prayed, and likewise women, and that could be with a hood or with a specific way of wearing the hair. But the expressions Paul uses in Greek aren't any of the typical expressions, and we don't know exactly what the norm was. So it's really hard to tell exactly what he wants them to be doing with their head or their hair. But it's clear that he wants to say women aren't just like men, and women need something about their head needs to look different than men's heads in worship. He has another sort of theological go at this, where he says that man is the image and glory of God, and woman is the image and glory of man. And again, that shows that women need to have, quote, authority on their head. Some people actually think that means women need to have authority over their head, like they get to say what to do with it. And as if the theological arguments weren't unclear enough, Paul says, for this reason, a woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. That's verse 10. Because of what angels? And what do angels have to do with women wearing a hat during prophecy? There were a couple proposals in the ancient world for what this meant. No one has a really satisfactory explanation. The explanation, the earliest comment we have about this is from Tertullian. And Tertullian said this is to protect women from the gaze of potentially lusty angels who might find them attractive. This alludes to the story back in Genesis 6, which says that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were attractive and came down and mated with them. And that story in Genesis 6 spawned a really widespread tradition that angels had mated with women in the primordial time, and that had created a race of half-breed giants, and that's who God destroyed with the flood. This is a prominent story in the book of 1st Enoch and so on. So Tertullian reads this in Paul and says, oh yeah, women have to have a hat so that the angels don't see them. I suspect many of you will not find that a plausible explanation. The other alternatives, maybe the best one going, is that angels are somehow people who keep charge of God's order, and I don't know. There's no really good explanation. And Paul then adds one more argument. Women, you need something on your head because of the angels, because man's the head of you, because man is the image of God and you're the image of man, and because nature itself teaches you that men should have short hair and women have long hair. And of course, that's an odd argument since men's hair is only short, not naturally, but if men cut it, and women's hair is whatever length they want it to be. In any event, we can't spend more time with these intricate arguments. I think what we can step back from and say is this. 1, Paul takes for granted and approves of women actively participating in the communal worship and participating in prayer and in prophecy. Otherwise, he would have said something really short and pithy to the Corinthians. Hey guys, I heard the ladies are praying and prophesying. Whoa, I don't like that one bit. But he doesn't. He just gives this lengthy and somewhat convoluted argument for how they should wear their hair or cover their heads. The second point that needs to be made is that the Corinthians were doing something that suggested they were doing away with gender differences altogether. And I've said before, I think one way to understand the confusion the Corinthians find themselves in is think of the Corinthians as the church that took Paul seriously in everything he taught them. So when Paul told them all things are lawful, they embraced it wholeheartedly, to the point that they do things that Paul sort of pulls his hair out and says, oh my gosh, I certainly didn't mean, when I said all things are lawful in Christ, or Christ gave us freedom, I didn't mean you could do that. And likewise, Paul said, in Christ there is no male and female. And I suspect the Corinthian female prophets said, we're going to act just like the male prophets. And here Paul winds it back a little bit. Now, we need to look at developments in early Christianity in terms of the roles of women, and we'll stick for the moment with the question of women in congregations, because we start to see a diversity of viewpoints, even in Paul's letters and in what are usually called the Deutero-Pauline letters, like the pastoral epistles. So even in 1 Corinthians, a couple of chapters later, Paul gives this advice, and you can see why it's a little hard to reconcile with 1 Corinthians 11. He says, in all the churches of the saints, women should be silent. Well, how are they going to be silent if they're praying and prophesying? He goes on, they're not permitted to speak. They should be subordinate. It's shameful for a woman to speak in church. I will let you look closely at Bart Ehrman's treatment in the textbook for the arguments that this might be a paragraph that was added later to 1 Corinthians. It may or may not be an interpolation to 1 Corinthians. It might be original. If it's original, you can see that it is a little bit ill at ease with the earlier instruction for how women are supposed to prophesy. Without question, 1 Corinthians 14 here makes a point similar to the one we find in 1 Timothy. We find similar points. Paul's giving instruction in 1 Timothy for how women should conduct themselves. They should pray, they should dress modestly, they should be silent, they should submit. And just as in 1 Corinthians 14, twice we see this note of keeping silence, of subordination. In a similar way, we see in both of these passages, he or whoever the author is, buttresses the point of instruction by appealing to the law. Now in 1 Corinthians 14, it just says, as the law also says. He doesn't say what law he's talking about, what passage from the law. But in 1 Timothy, it's pretty clear, we know exactly what part of the law he's talking about, where he's talking about the creation story. So it looks like 1 Timothy can kind of expand on what 1 Corinthians 14 means. This we want to just dwell on a teensy bit because you may recall from your reading of Genesis that it's hard to see exactly that the woman deserves all the blame in the Genesis story. For that matter, it's not entirely fair when Paul says man is the glory of God and woman is the glory of man. After all, according to Genesis 1, both man and woman are created equally in the image of God. But in this case, Paul's talking about Genesis 2 and 3. And the issue is, it is Eve who is deceived, not Adam. And there is a long list of Jewish interpreters, Paul's not the only one, a long list of Jewish interpreters who single this out as evidence that women are inherently unstable, prone to be misled, and just completely inadequate for the task of teaching. So Paul, or whoever wrote this passage in 1 Corinthians and whoever wrote 1 Timothy, they're not the odd man out in terms of the ancient assessment of women or in terms of the ancient interpretation of Genesis 1 through 3. Most Jewish readers and Christian readers said, aha, women are bad. We just want to note, though, that there is a clever other way of reading Genesis 2 and 3, which by no means simply implicates Eve. There are several puzzling details in Genesis 2 and 3, and Avot de Rabbi Natan notes one of them. And this tends to exculpate Eve and put the blame really on Adam. So, God told Adam, of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, and the day you eat of it you shall die. But Adam didn't tell God's words to Eve as they had been spoken. How does he conclude that? Well, because when Eve quotes the words of God to the serpent, she adds a clause. Eve says to the serpent, God told us we can't eat of the tree in the middle of the garden, nor can we touch it, or we'll die. Why did she add those words? Well, Avot de Rabbi Natan concludes, Adam misquoted God to Eve. After all, Eve had not been created yet when God gave that commandment to Adam. So the only person who could have told Eve is Adam. So Adam misquoted the words and added this clause. He thought, oh, I better keep my wife safe. I'll tell her not even to touch the tree. But by misquoting those words, he opened up an opportunity for the devil. Why? Well, the devil says, Eve, so you're not allowed to touch it, huh? And the devil touched it, and he shook it, and he bumped up against it, and he said, go ahead, Eve, touch it. And she touched it, and she didn't die. So Eve concluded, everything my husband has told me is lies. And she thought, well, if it's not true when Adam told me I can't touch it, it's probably not true when Adam told me I can't eat it. I can't trust anything anymore. Hence, who's to blame? Adam, for misquoting the word of God. All right, we don't want to be overly bogged down in the interpretation of Genesis 2 and 3 or in 1 Timothy's instructions for women to keep quiet in church. To conclude, so that we keep the major thread here, we note 1, women were typically active in worship services. They prophesied and prayed in church. 2, Paul himself makes some gender-based distinctions from men's and women's conduct in the congregations. 3, either Paul himself or someone writing after him and in his name definitely put the brakes on women's roles in congregations. And in some congregations, in some places, women were instructed to be silent. Now, if 1 Corinthians 14 is authentically Pauline, and we have to make sense of 1 Corinthians having both instructions for how women pray and prophesy and having instructions that women should be silent, you can see that's really hard to make sense of from a single person in a single letter. The way people try to make sense of it, who think they're both by Paul, is that women are allowed to prophesy and pray, but there's some other moment in the service, in the gathering, perhaps a teaching or a moment of doing explanation of Scripture, and in that context, women are not permitted to speak, to teach, to ask questions. I don't know. You can see the problem. You can see the considerable temptation to think that 1 Corinthians 14 was added by someone who had the same outlook as the outlook that we find in 1 Timothy. But just at the same time that more brakes are being put on Christian, the roles for women in Christianity, I want to come back to this Montanist movement, which could be the subject of a whole lecture. Here we just want to note that this spirit of new prophecy spread throughout Asia Minor, and these female prophets were co-leaders with Montanus. So this is called Montanism, but the women had just as much to do with it. And remarkably, although all sorts of new bishops complained about this movement, they never said women shouldn't prophesy. They said we don't like some of the things they say. Basically, they clearly thought it was usurping their authority, but they didn't say, when on earth has it ever been permitted for women to prophesy? And it's just interesting that even in a movement that the bishops disliked, they recognized, yeah, that is an ancient custom with us. That's not ipso facto out of bounds. I want to say a few words now about a different aspect of women and gender in early Christianity. And that is, I want to speak a little bit about the way that Christians not only gave certain roles to women, some of which were uncommon, but also the way they introduced a different way of thinking about maleness and femaleness. This might seem a little subtle, but follow with me. I'll try to keep it as clear as possible. I want to come back to this statement in Galatians that we usually hear as something egalitarian, that is, showing the equality of male and female. You'll notice in this saying that there's a certain disjuncture between the first two clauses. There is no Jew or Greek, slave or free, and then the third, male and female. Why doesn't it just say there is no male or female? Well, what it looks like is like this is a quotation, as if you could almost say, let's put little quotation marks around, there is no longer, quote, male and female. That is the way God made things. If this is so, and bear with me, you'll see where this is going. There's a sense in which, in Paul's thought, because in Christ God has begun recreating, the division of male and female may not apply. And of course, for Paul, even when speaking about questions of gender, he insists the first creation is passing away. It's the reason in 1 Corinthians 7 he says he would prefer people not to marry. We'll say more about that passage in a moment. So to slightly overstate it, just so you can see clearly what I'm driving at, and I'm here elaborating a proposal that a lot of scholars have made and developed, is it possible that what Paul imagines is that the male-female distinction is overcome in Christ? And now in Christ, it's possible for what? And that's what we now want to tease out just a little bit. If there's no longer male and female, for you're all one, does that mean there are no longer males and females? Or, thinking about the profound sort of depths of ancient misogyny, that the profound assumption in the ancient world that the female was somehow a defective version of a male. Is it possible that what this is saying is, the ancient separation has been overcome, the defective version of humans has been fixed now? Let me tease this out by a couple passages. The Gospel of Thomas. In the last saying of the Gospel of Thomas, Simon Peter says to Jesus, Mary should leave. Females aren't worthy of life. And you might expect Jesus to say, au contraire, I've often interacted with women and I uphold the goodness of women. But it's not exactly what Jesus says. Jesus says, no, Mary can stay, but why? Jesus says, because I am going to make her male. For every female that becomes male will enter the kingdom of heaven. Do you see the implicit logic there? The idea is that with Christ or in following Christ, it's possible for women to get fixed, as it were, to become male, and therefore to be saved. Now, I don't think that saying goes back to Jesus. I don't think that saying in the Gospel of Thomas, although Thomas records many authentic sayings, that's probably not one of them. But you can see what we might call a trajectory of early Christian thought. A trajectory which says, what Christ has done is fixed this old problem. I'll give a passage which shows this even more clearly. In the Gospel of Philip, and again, I'm not proposing that the Gospel of Philip accurately represents Jesus' sentiment, but it shows one way Christians were thinking about gender. The Gospel of Philip says, the separation of woman from man, that primordial separation, is what leads to death. And Christ came to repair the separation that was from the beginning and to unite the two. Now, if you're still with me here and you see that there is a trajectory, one line of thought in early Christianity, not the mainstream thought perhaps, but a significant line of thought, which said, this is what Jesus fixed. He fixed the problem of womanhood. What does that actually mean in practice? Well, it probably means a couple different things, but the short answer, I think, is that it means for many Christians, especially in the 2nd century, so really after the period of the New Testament, it means women becoming men in the sense that they give up the traditional roles of women. You can see some hint of this already, perhaps, and later Christians would appeal to this, some evidence of this in Jesus praising the existence of eunuchs, that is, asexual people, for the kingdom of heaven. You can see this in a sense, perhaps, in Paul's instructions in 1 Corinthians 7, where although he doesn't forbid marriage, he certainly deprecates it as the second best option. We'll say more about that in just a second. But where we really see what it looks like for a woman to become a man in early Christianity is in all sorts of stories about heroic women like Thecla. Here's one of many early pictures. Thecla was a saint popular for women, for women's pilgrimages. There were shrines to Thecla throughout the world. And in the exceedingly popular Acts of Paul and Thecla, we get a snapshot of what a lot of Christians in the 2nd century thought was the heart of the Christian message. Women and young people go to Paul and you could substitute the name Andrew or Thomas or anyone else in their own respective acts. And they are taught, you must fear God and live chastely. That is, abandon sexuality. For a significant swath of Christianity, that was the gospel. And when people converted to the worship of the God of Christ, they also broke off their engagement, or if they were married, they lived celibately. This was part of a woman becoming a man, being freed from childbirth, which of course often resulted in the woman's death, from the structures of the home and everything that went with that. There was a certain liberation from everything that bound women to womanhood, and to free them from that meant completely rebuilding the structures. And so we find comments, for instance, as women have broken free of their traditional roles, like in the martyrdom of Perpetua, one of the earliest Christian martyr accounts, where Perpetua is separated from her fiancé. As she is stripped in the arena, she says, I became a man, as if to say now, about to be freed of my body, but already freed of certain social ties. As it were, Jesus has made me a man. And from a later time, we get not only desert fathers, these radical ascetics in the desert, but desert mothers. So there's Mother Sarah. And just a typical little repartee, two old men come to Amasara, and they say, oh, let's humiliate this old lady. And I'm abbreviating here, but she ends up saying to them, you know what? I might be by nature a woman, but in my thoughts, I'm a man. And she ends up putting them in their place and saying, I'm the one who's a man, you're the one who are women. How has she become a man? Well, if women in ancient thought are characterized by roles such as motherhood or being a wife, she's escaped them by renouncing all such conduct. And if women are characterized in the ancient world by being susceptible to passions, and again, they have negative views, that they're susceptible to wanting pretty things and decorations and so on, she, by her steely asceticism, has freed herself. She's the man. Anyway, we could say more about this, but suffice it to say that this is a one way Christians transformed the understanding of gender. It's not only that women as women played roles in churches, it's also that women like Thecla cut their hair short and dressed as men, and then did the things men did. We conclude by just looking a little more closely at Paul's instructions in 1 Corinthians 7. Because, as I said, it's not fair to Paul's message to say that he simply forbids sexuality. And that's the portrait we get in the 2nd century Acts of the Apostles. But probably that's not fair to Paul's own message, and we want to just tease out his own message. And in a sense, we could think about, what does it look like when Paul answers the question, is it okay to be married? Is it okay for married people to have sexual relations? Paul, I'm engaged, but I've become a Christian. Should I go through with my marriage? These are the questions the Corinthians have written to him with. And they're not altogether new questions just for Christians. At the same time, a sort of standard question that was debated by philosophers of the different schools was, is marriage a handicap to being a philosopher? And so this is an essay written by Musonius Rufus, almost exactly at the same time Paul is writing 1 Corinthians. Musonius Rufus is a very popular Roman Stoic philosopher. So it's sort of interesting to compare Paul and Musonius and see how they answer. They're not answering exactly the same question, but a similar question. Now, before we tease out their answers, just think about what Paul's background is. He's a Pharisee. He's using the Old Testament as sacred scripture. How would the Old Testament answer this sort of question? Well, think about Genesis 1. Male and female God made them, and the very next verse in Genesis 1, verse 28 says, be fruitful and multiply. Humankind is built to reproduce. It's God's injunction. And the goodness of married life is echoed throughout many passages in Scripture, but think of the Proverbs. Rejoice in the wife of your youth. And this carries on into rabbinic literature, where we have sayings such as, if any man is not married, he's no man at all. You would expect, if we were comparing Paul and Musonius, that it would be the person of the Jewish tradition, Paul, with this biblical heritage, who would uphold the goodness of marriage. But in fact, it's the Hellenistic figure, Musonius, who has far more positive things to speak of. Musonius, and we'll just outline his essay first, Musonius says, look, folks, and I quote him here, the creator of our species would not have given us two types of bodies, male and female, and the strong desire we feel for getting together, unless the creator wanted us to be united. It is natural. These desires we have are good, and we should follow them in married life. And Musonius says, furthermore, it's true that a philosopher will be undistracted by domestic life. But gosh darn it, if you undermine marriage, you destroy the home, the city, and all of humanity. This is a foundation block by which we build up good order in the world. Okay, there's a Roman answer. Let's come to Paul. This is the same Paul, chapter 13 of this epistle, which we read at weddings. Love is patient, love is kind, and so on. That is a very beautiful chapter. And it's no mistake that it's that chapter that we read at weddings and not 1 Corinthians 7. Because in 1 Corinthians 7, what's the best thing Paul can bring himself to say about marriage? Well, it's not a sin. I guess it's better to marry than to burn with passion. This is hardly a glowing endorsement of marriage. And in fact, Paul makes it clear. On the one hand, marriage is not sinful, but it is not his preferred condition. He says, I wish everyone were like I am, unattached. And Paul says, look, there's multiple problems. First of all, if you're married, you will be anxious about your husband or wife. But the unmarried person just worries about pleasing the Lord. He says, if you're married and your husband or wife dies, you can remarry. But in my judgment, you would be more blessed if you remain solo. Paul clearly thinks this is not ideal, but it's not a sin. And he does say if you are married, you should continue sexual relations, except for a time of prayer. Interesting comment. Why does Paul not stick with the biblical tradition and say, be fruitful and multiply, God made us this way, it's a good thing, it's always been this way? Why isn't he even as positive as Musonius Rufus is, his pagan counterpart? Well, he gives us an answer. He says, it's because of the impending crisis. And that could sound like there was some sort of trouble in Corinth, right? Some sort of, I don't know, economic or environmental crisis, but it's not. Paul's talking about the end. The reason I'm giving you this advice, he says, is because the appointed time has grown short. Therefore, let even those who have wives live as if they didn't. The shape of this world is passing away, he says. And whereas Musonius worries that if people stop marrying to pursue philosophy and theology, they will be undermining the greater common good. I think Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians 7, there's not that much time left. We don't need to be particularly worried about the greater common good. This world already stands condemned, and he's just not that invested. At the very least, let me say this. In a chapter devoted to the question of whether it's okay to marry or okay to have sexual relations, it's noteworthy that he never says a word about the blessing of having children, or never mentions love in this chapter. we need to draw this lecture, which has already gone on too long, to a conclusion, so I'll just recapitulate some of the main points. First, it should be clearly noted that women played prominent roles there in Jesus' ministry as well as in Paul's churches. So they surface as patrons above all. And I think that passage from Luke 8:2-3 is really striking. They're bankrolling, they're supporting, and even accompanying in Jesus' ministry. They're apostles and missionaries. I put missionaries beside apostles because we don't want to suggest exactly that they're one of the 12 apostles, but Paul calls Junia an apostle. And in Paul's sense of that word, that means the people sent on official church business. He names women in the highest roles he has, deacons and apostles. They're clearly leaders. The churches meet in their homes. And Paul's quite comfortable referring to this and that co-worker as women. And finally, and above all, they're prophets as a category that was recognized in the ancient world as one that women had filled for centuries. This is a central role they have in the early Christian movement, and they had real renown as prophets, some of which has been probably minimized, so that in the book of Acts we just get a passing reference to the daughters of Philip, whereas in fact they were really well known throughout the entire continent of Asia Minor. And if we wanted to recapitulate some of the second half of this lecture, we'd just say that we could perhaps highlight two trajectories. On the one hand, this notion that the last saying of the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says, "I will make her male." Are women accepted? Yes. But women are accepted in the sense that they are freed from their domestic roles. They're freed to become male. So the positive valence of male over female is maintained. What's quite countercultural here is that the women can become men by asceticism, by rejecting traditional roles, by having minds as hard as men's. And I'm just parroting the ancient prejudice there. On the other hand, about the same time that this idea of tearing down the household structure and all the prescribed roles for women that entails, we are also getting letters written in Paul's name and in others' names that propose divinely sanctioned household codes, so that the reason you are a good, dutiful wife and you raise your kids and you obey your husband is because God wants it that way. Gendered roles, that is fairly conventional gender expectations, are hereby christened. They're explained not as merely, oh, that's how it happens to be right now, let's just play along, but they're presented in 1 Peter, in Ephesians and Colossians, and in the pastoral epistles as God's will. There is an order. Men are above women. Men and women are above their children, and free men and women are above their slaves. There's not space in this lecture to sort of go ahead and unpack the subsequent history of the ways men and women through the ages have appropriated this complex, what the New Testament has bequeathed us, which is more than one vision for God's will for men and women, but you can see how these different strands continue to be drawn on and to contribute to the contemporary disagreements over, should women be bishops? Should women be archbishops? Should there even be such a thing as bishops? What if we have a more charismatic ecclesiastical structure? Is it relevant then? And so on and so forth. So a complicated picture, but one rich in manifold ways.
Problems of using these texts historically. If you remember early in the semester, we talked about Galatians 1 and 2 and Acts, and we tried to compare exactly when did Paul go where with regard to Jerusalem, Damascus, Antioch, and we saw that it's very, very difficult to harmonize Galatians 1 and 2 with the account of Acts and Paul's movements around Jerusalem. We've also got a lot of other situations where this would be very difficult. I mentioned the difference between Matthew and Luke as far as the birth narratives. According to, just to try to figure out how this would work, if you took the birth narratives of Matthew and Luke, it would be very, very difficult to find out historically what happened. So, for example, if you just take Matthew, as I've said before, his family seems to simply be in Bethlehem. It doesn't say they're from Galilee. It doesn't say they're originally from Nazareth. They're just in Bethlehem. And they're in Bethlehem well before Jesus is born because the wise men in the east see the star, and it takes them enough time to travel from Persia. We're supposed to understand from the narrative because they're called Magi, and those are wise men from Persia, all the way to Jerusalem. They meet up with King Herod the Great. He gets his wise men to consult. They then find out they're supposed to go to Bethlehem. They journey to Bethlehem, and then they get there not long after Jesus is born. So according to Matthew, you don't have any time actually in the narrative of Matthew for the whole moving from Nazareth to Bethlehem narrative that you get in the Gospel of Luke. You just don't have time in Matthew. They're just there. And then the angel appears to Joseph in a dream and says, Herod's going to kill all the babies. So Joseph takes the family. They move to Egypt for a while. He gets another dream years later, how many years, who knows, but saying that Herod the Great is now dead. So they go back. They start to go back to Bethlehem because it says that's their home, right? They go back home. They're going to go to Bethlehem. Instead, they move to Galilee to avoid Herod's son, who is at the time, according to Matthew, ruling in Judea. That's the sort of narrative. You get to Luke, and it's very different. They're from Nazareth. That's sort of Mary's hometown is Nazareth. All the pregnancy of Jesus takes place with Mary in Nazareth. She even goes to Judea to visit her kinswoman Elizabeth, who's the mother of John the Baptist, according to the Gospel of Luke. And then she goes back to Nazareth, and then it's according to this census, the world census, that they go to Bethlehem. And it's why they're in Bethlehem in the stable, because you don't have a stable in Matthew. They're just maybe in a home, or according to a lot of traditions, there was a cave somewhere that Jesus was born in. But it's in Luke that you get the whole story about the Christmas story about the stable that Jesus is born in, because there's no room in the inn. They stay in that area for a month. We know that because it says that they first have Jesus circumcised on the 8th day from his birth, and then the time of purification takes place according to Leviticus, which is about a month long. They take Jesus to the presentation in the temple in Jerusalem, and it's after that, so a month or so after his birth, that they then move back home to Nazareth. Now, there's no way you can basically get these two narratives to fit together in any respectable historical way. Does that mean that nobody's ever tried to do it? No, of course, you've got all kinds of very, very smart fundamentalists who believe that the New Testament has to be accurate in every historical and scientific detail, or they believe then it can't be Scripture. And they will figure out some way to try to make sure that both these narratives can be fit together. But what I'm telling you is that no reputable historian will accept this, because you just have to fudge the stuff too much. You have to fudge the data. So what do we believe about the birth of Jesus? Most of us think we don't know anything about the birth of Jesus. All the Christmas stories are later tradition. Probably the one thing that most of us would say is that Jesus probably was from Nazareth. His family was simply from Nazareth because he's called Jesus of Nazareth. And the traditions that got him to Bethlehem for his birth are probably later pietistic traditions that Matthew and Luke later developed for different reasons, but to get Jesus born in Bethlehem for fulfillment of prophecy reasons. So if you take the birth of Jesus as in Luke and Matthew, it's, from a historical point of view, it's impossible really to harmonize them without coming up with fantastic, unbelievable conjugations of Jesus moving back and forth to Egypt and the Holy Family and all this sort of thing. We get lots of other kinds of things about this too. What are some obvious historical problems with a historical Jesus? Well, one of the things is the trial of Jesus. There are different versions of the trial of Jesus in the Gospels. And unfortunately, basically, most scholars will say that we don't really know what happened to the trial of Jesus. We don't even know for sure whether there was any kind of official trial. It may have been that he was just arrested in the middle of the night. He was just then, they've given permission to be crucified, and he was crucified the next day. That would be the sensible way of doing things. You didn't have to have, the Romans didn't need elaborate trials in order to crucify Jews who were rabble-rousers in the first century. They did it all the time. But if you look at some of the details of the trial, notice how they're very different. Mark 14, get your Bibles out. Today we are talking about the historical Jesus, but I'm not just going to tell you what I believe or what scholars believe about the historical Jesus. I'm going to try to show you why scholars come up with ideas that we have, how we get there. What is our method for arriving at historical Jesus discussions? So look at Mark 14, verse 53. In the wrong place. They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes were assembled. Peter had followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he was sitting with the guards, warming himself at the fire. Now the chief priests and the whole council were looking for testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. For many gave false testimony against him, and their testimony did not agree. Some stood up and gave false testimony against him, saying, "We have heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands.'" But even on this point, their testimony did not agree. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, "Have you no answer? What is it that they testify against you?" But he was silent and did not answer. Again the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" Jesus said, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." That's a quotation from Daniel. So Jesus basically just says, "I am," and then quotes Daniel. And then it says, the high priest accused him of prophecy. And then look at chapter 15. Beginning of chapter 15. As soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered him, "You say so." Then the chief priests accused him of many things. Pilate asked him again, "Have you no answer? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further reply, so that Pilate was amazed. Now notice, all Jesus says at his trial, according to Mark, the oldest of our written testimonies, is "I am," and a quotation of Scripture at one point, and then "so you say" in the next trial before Pilate. Now compare that to what goes on in the Gospel of John. I mentioned this a bit in my lecture on the Gospel of John, how its narrative details are very different from the Synoptic Gospels. One of the places where this is really different is the trial of Jesus. John 18, verse 19. I'm not going to read all of this because it's just way too long. This is part of the interesting thing is that the trial of Jesus goes on for a long time in the Gospel of John. The high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples, about his teaching. Jesus answered, "I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple where all the Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me?" Already, Jesus has said a ton more now than he said in the other Gospels at his trial. But then he just keeps going on. He said some more things. When he had said this, one of the police standing nearby struck Jesus in the face, saying, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" Jesus answered, "If I have spoken wrongly, testify to the wrong, but if I have spoken rightly, why do you strike me?" Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So according to John, Annas and Caiaphas are kinfolk, and they're sort of both members of the high priestly family. So you can go on and on. At 28, verse 28, is the trial before they took Jesus to Pilate. Pilate went out to the Jews and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered, "If this man were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law." The Jews answered, "We are not permitted," blah, 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 blah. It goes on. Pilate talks to Jesus. "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you ask this on your own? Did others tell you about it?" Pilate said, "I'm not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is..." Jesus just has a whole conversation with Pilate, which leads to that wonderfully quotable phrase that everybody knows about, where finally Jesus talks about truth, and Pilate says, in a phrase that could be sincere, or a lot of people answer it as being cynical, "What is truth?" Very famous quotation from the Gospel of John. And then, of course, there's the whole passage. Any of you seen the Jesus Christ Superstar, the play or the movie? There's a whole scene where Herod, this is actually the son of Herod the Great now, but there's a trial before Herod also in the Gospel of John. Not really in Mark at all, but in the Gospel of John, you get this whole trial before Herod. And according to Jesus Christ Superstar, this is when Herod kind of dances around on this raft and has showgirls, and they all do this. So you are the Christ, you're the great Jesus Christ. You know, prove to me that you're no fool. Walk across my swimming pool, and all this sort of thing. So there's a whole scene, and Jesus Christ Superstar, the whole scene wouldn't be possible without the Gospel of John, because it's not in the other Gospels. So this is a famous scene. All of that's different in John. So what's historical? How do scholars decide? You have these very, very different. Was Jesus completely silent at his trial, as it seems to be in the Gospel of Mark? Did he not offer any reasons for what he did? Or did he have theological and philosophical discussions with Pilate about his message? What's historical? In that case, basically most historians are going to say, none of it is. None of the trial stuff can we be confident would be historical. For one thing, we just have this very, very differences, but there's one very little interesting piece of evidence about this. According to all the Gospels, where were the disciples after Jesus was arrested? Anybody remember? They vamoosed. The Gospels say that the disciples ran away at the arrest of Jesus. So maybe, according to these traditions, maybe Peter was there sort of in a courtyard removed from the trial. But none of the disciples of Jesus would have been allowed to be present at any trial, whether it was of his high priest or Pilate. They wouldn't have been allowed in. These were peasants from Galilee. They're fishermen. They don't go walking into Pilate's headquarters. So who would have been there to report these different trial things? There are no stenographers in the ancient world sitting down taking notes of these trials. There are no court records. There are no journalists. Nobody was there who later Christians had access to so that they could possibly have known what went on in the trial. So according to most historians, we just say all of this trial stuff was very much made up by later Christians. Why? Because they figured you had to have a trial if you're going to have Jesus condemned. And so they figured, well, what would have taken place? These gospel writers, or maybe they're using traditions that developed before them, they're using traditions that develop because people just say, well, what would have happened at Jesus' trial? What's likely to have happened? And then they make up that likeliness and they put that into the story. Now, so you've got a couple of different situations where we historians are very, very skeptical about some of the basic aspects of the Gospels accounts as far as what they tell us about the historical Jesus. The birth narratives, we just throw up our hands. The trials before Pilate, no, probably none of it rises to the level of history. But this leads to a couple of different problems. The first one I'm going to talk about is, so what? And I'm saying this because once critical scholars start talking about the historical Jesus, we immediately start stepping into sand traps. On the one hand, we have good Christian people who are a bit afraid that if you start questioning the historical reliability of the Gospels, then you're going to undermine every aspect of Christian faith. If the birth narratives are not as they say they are in the Gospels, then how can you trust any of it to be true? And if none of it is true, how do you even know that Jesus actually even existed? Or even if he did exist, how do you know that he wasn't a liar or a magician or just a bum? How do you, and if that's true, why have faith? Why not just give up the whole thing? So on the one hand, you've got Christians who are very threatened by using typical historical tools on the Gospels and the very question of the historical Jesus. On the other hand, we have just as many people who are anti-Christian and who they want to grab onto this and say, aha, notice how reputable scholars like Dale Martin, Woolsey Professor of Religious Studies at Yale University, points out that not everything in the Gospels is reliably history. Well, that means it's all a bunch of bunk. And every Christian in the world is basing their faith on things that are known by scholars to be lies. Well, that's not exactly right either, is it? So on both sides, you get some people who grab onto any sort of idea that historians would say these are discrepancies in the Gospels, or these are places where we don't have historical evidence to back us up, and they want to run with that precisely in order to impugn the faith of Christians. Now, so scholars have to be very careful. What we basically want to say, there was actually one or two scholars in the 19th century, reputable scholars, Bruno Bauer was one of them, a German scholar, who denied that Jesus ever existed. He just said it was all, even the person of Jesus was a myth created by the church. And you'll find every once in a while somebody on the web or internet or something, or in some crazy blog saying that Jesus never existed. But reputable historical scholars all admit that Jesus of Nazareth existed. There was a guy back there, Jesus of Nazareth. There's just too much evidence that he existed, and it's just not controvertible when it comes to reliable historical evidence. But that's a big difference from saying, yes, we believe he existed, and there are some things we think we can say about him, to accepting all of the gospel materials as reliable. So scholars basically are caught in the middle of saying, we believe there was a Jesus of Nazareth. We believe we might even be able to say some things as historians about who he was, what he said, what he did, why he may have been executed, and that sort of thing. But that means we have to use critical historical tools to analyze these faith-based texts, these theological texts, what are indeed, in some cases, mythological texts. We read theological texts to try to figure out what we can say historically. And that leads to the other issue. I keep saying the historical Jesus, because a whole lot of people have the idea that once I give you the historical Jesus, then you've got the real Jesus. You've got Jesus as he really was, and therefore Jesus as he really is. Now the problem with that is that theologians, and I can put on my historical hat most of the time because I actually have a job as a historian. I don't really have a job as a theologian, so I kind of call myself sometimes an amateur theologian. But if I want to put on my amateur theologian hat, I can make a case for you why the historical Jesus is not a very good foundation for Christian faith. It's not reliable as a foundation of Christian faith. It's not sufficient as a foundation for Christian faith. The theological Jesus, the Jesus of Christian confession, is not the historical Jesus. The Jesus of theological confession is the Jesus that matches what the church has traditionally believed about Jesus. So, for example, a Jesus that matches the creeds, a Jesus that matches Christian confessions. So one of the most important things for Christian confession, for example, is would you lose your faith if you believe that Jesus wasn't born in Bethlehem but was rather born in Nazareth? Probably most Christians would probably say, well, no, that's not really that important. What's the most central thing for most Christians for Christian faith? Do you believe that somehow God was in Jesus Christ reconciling the world to himself, to quote the Apostle Paul? Or do you believe that Jesus Christ is divine? Do you believe that Jesus is God? Do you believe that Jesus is God incarnate, God in the flesh? That's a fundamental aspect of Christian faith for most Christians. But notice, that's not something that historians can pronounce about one way or another. There's no possible way that I, practicing history by the normal historiographical tools of history, could tell you whether God was in Jesus Christ. Is there? I mean, just think about it. How would I test that? How would I figure it out? What would count as a positive proof? What would count as a non-controvertible negative truth? There's no such thing. So when I'm talking to you about the historical Jesus, I have to get over several hurdles. One of the hurdles is trying to show you that the historical Jesus is a construction made by historians practicing the typical trade of modern historians. It's just like, for example, if I say, what's the historical Socrates? We don't have direct access to Socrates either, right? Socrates left no writings. All we know about Socrates are mainly the things that either Plato, his disciples, said about him, or Xenophon, another of his disciples, said about him, and a few other things. And you know what? Plato and Xenophon don't give the same picture of Socrates. So figuring out who is the historical Socrates is also a difficult historical question that historians debate about. So that's the one thing, is just using typical historical data. So for example, if I say, we're going to talk about George Washington, and we're going to talk about the George Washington of history, the George Washington that historians will come up with, that's a different George Washington than, say, let's talk about the George Washington of popular American piety. The George Washington of popular American piety threw $1 across the Potomac. No historian believes that George Washington threw a dollar across the Potomac, at least not Mount Vernon. If you've been to Mount Vernon, you know that's a superhuman feat. Historians, in popular American piety, George Washington, as a little boy, chopped down the cherry tree, and when his father got onto him, he said, "I cannot tell a lie, Father, it is I." That's a George Washington. It's the George Washington of American popular tradition. And it's important to know about that, about George Washington. No historian believes that George Washington as a child actually chopped down the cherry tree and that happened. And mainly because we actually found the preacher who made up the story for a sermon. It made a good sermon point. Remember my motto? What's the motto of the class? De omnibus dubitandum, especially when you're listening to preachers or professors. So the historical Jesus is not the same thing as the theological Jesus. So that's one point to remember. This is another theoretical issue. And this is very confusing for some people when you first start thinking about it. We often use the word history in two different ways in common English. We often use the word history to refer simply to stuff in the past. So, for example, the Civil War is historical. That just means it happened in the past. That's one way of using the word history, but it's kind of a sloppy way. Because if I want to say the history of the Civil War, I'm not really talking in that case of the whole Civil War, right? A historical account of the Civil War is a narrative that will be constructed by a historian to represent a story about whatever happened in the past. But it can't replicate the past, right? In order to replicate the Civil War, you would have to actually have the full, 4 years? Wasn't it 4 years? However long the Civil War took to fight, you would have to have that amount of time, because every tiny detail, every action, every person, every word, every letter, everything anybody said, every tiny battle, every ant that crawled over a decomposing corpse is part of the past of the Civil War. That's not the history of the Civil War. That's the Civil War as it occurred in the past. The history of the Civil War is an account of whatever happened in the past that a historian constructs and then tells you. So when we use the word history in that more professional sense, we're not talking about the past, we're talking about an account of the past. So often philosophers of history like to separate these two words out, and they'll use the word past for the event that occurred in the past. They'll use the word history for an account of the event that occurred in the past. Now notice what that means. Histories are accessible to us, right? You can go to the store and buy a history of the Civil War. You can buy a history of George Washington. And you can buy a history of Jesus Christ. Does the history of the Civil War that you buy in the store give you the Civil War? No. It gives you an account of the Civil War. The actual Civil War is radically inaccessible to you. It's inaccessible. You can't get it. Think about this. How would you actually recover the actual past of the Civil War? How would you do it? Let's say you can't travel in time like in TV. Let's just say that hypothetically. Does the Civil War exist somewhere in space where the light that it emitted from it is still flying off in the universe somewhere? And if you could, faster than the speed of light, fly out to that thing, you could actually experience the Civil War as it actually happened? Well, maybe theoretically. But for any of us sitting here in this room, that's not possible, is it? In other words, this is a radical thought to some people. But the past no longer exists for you and me. It's radically gone. The past is non-existent when it comes to our experiences of it. All we can experience are different accounts of the past. We can experience different constructions of the past. We cannot experience the past itself. It's gone. It's lost to us forever. That means the historical Jesus, as Jesus actually existed in history, is inaccessible to you. You will not find him. You cannot find him. You will never find him. What you can do is using the trades, the tricks of the trade of modern historiography, you can play by the rules of modern historiography, and you can construct a historical Jesus. That means a Jesus of Nazareth constructed using the same kinds of historical tools as historians would use to construct the historical George Washington, the historical Socrates, the historical Plato, the historical Abraham Lincoln. That's a construction, though. So those theoretical points are very important, because when I talk about the historical Jesus, you cannot think, like most popular people think, that what I'm talking about is the real Jesus, the Jesus as he really was, or certainly not the Jesus of Christian faith. What I'm giving you is an account of Jesus that modern historians construct using the typical tools of modern historiography. That's a lot of theoretical philosophy of history stuff that I tried to boil down in straightforward language. Is there any question or comments about that before I go on? All that stuff is necessary, though, because people, especially when they turn to objects of faith, that you start asking historical questions, people's minds start turning into mud. All right, now let's just jump right in. What could we say about the historical Jesus as historians? Today I can't give you the whole thing. If you want the whole thing, all the answers to life, well, I won't give you cooking recipes and that kind of thing, but if you want all the answers to historical Jesus stuff as it comes from the expert moi, you can take my seminar in the fall that I'll be teaching on the historical Jesus. A whole semester just on the historical Jesus question. So I'll do that in the fall. I'm going to give you in the next 20 minutes a little version of sort of the results. I'll show you some of the results that I would say about the historical Jesus. And I'd also say that Bart Ehrman, the author of your textbook, will agree with most of this in his chapter in your textbook. If you want more of that, Bart Ehrman has a book on the historical Jesus called, I think it's called Jesus of Nazareth, or Apocalyptic Prophet of a New Millennium. It's also published by Oxford Press. It's several years old. But he and I agree to a great extent about this sort of thing. So if you want more of this, you can look at Bart's book, and it'll pretty much agree with a lot of the stuff that I'm going to say. Or you can take my seminar next fall. So here are some things that I think we can agree about, most historians might agree about, the historical Jesus. And then I'll tell you how we got there. So we're going to talk about first some results and then some methodology. First, the sign on the cross. Does anybody remember what the sign on the cross when Jesus is crucified says? Pardon? Say it again. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Anybody else? What did you say? Not here lies, but there's one verse that says, this is Jesus of Nazareth. And it's because the 4 different Gospels have slightly different wording. But they all have something version of Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, which is, of course, why you sometimes see this abbreviated from the Latin, right? If you've seen it in churches. Henry, have you ever seen that on a cross or something like that in a church? Jesus of Nazareth in Latin, Rex, King Judaeorum of the Jews. So that, notice how though it's like.
Hello.
Hello, sir. Thanks for letting me. I didn't want to interrupt. I can't see the video. I know you're playing the video, so.
No, I stopped it. I stopped it.
All right.
For now.
Don't let me interrupt. Yeah. How you doing, man?
All right.
Cool. I've just put the video on and just joined, so I'm not sure what's going on. So if you want to carry on, and I have no opinions on anything. So and I'm a little bit. I apologise, Sidney Winston. I'm a little bit inebriated, which
Well,
may
catch up to wherever you have to catch up to.
Right. But don't let me interrupt anyway.
Don't interrupt. Okay. Well, if you're not going to interrupt, are you watching YouTube? All right. Let me just show everybody what's going on here. Okay, so what happened is Wildheart popped into the room. Hello. Were you watching the YouTube at all there, Wildheart?
No, I've just tuned in and I've just joined, so I'm not sure what the video was about. So I didn't want to comment until I know what's going on. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let me see if I can play it both there and here at the same time, and then you can hear it.
Cheers.
See if that works.
Yeah.
You got that?
Yeah, I can see. Yeah.
Okay, good. Now, let me go back to the shit. Where is it? Oh, there it is. Okay, so you should be able to see exactly what's going on. And I'm gonna.
Cheers for that.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean.
Slightly different. Let's look. If you've got your Bibles, it's Mark 15:26. If you've got a parallel version, I'm going to be looking at Throckmorton because it has the synoptic parallels. It's Throckmorton, paragraph 249. But somebody put your finger on Mark 15:26. It's also Matthew 27:37. It's also Luke 23:38. And it's also John 19:19. Now in Mark 15:26 it says, the inscription of the charge against him read, the King of the Jews. That's it. And it goes on about this stuff. Look over right next to it on Matthew. It says, over his head they put the charge against him and said, this is Jesus, the King of the Jews. So it's slightly different. Luke 23, what did I say? 38? There it is, There was also an inscription over him, this is the King of the Jews. And who has the John version? John 19:19. Anybody put their finger on John 19:19?
So better?
Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And doesn't it say in John that it was in different languages? Or am I pretty That's right, Hebrew, Latin, and Greek in the Gospel of John. So that's what we've got.
I'm gonna say it's muted, but I can watch it on YouTube, so it's not a problem. Sorry about that.
Okay.
And why do we think it's historical? Well, for one thing, it comes from at least two independent sources, right? What are the two independent sources that it comes from? It's in all four Gospels, but all four Gospels aren't independent sources, are they? Why? Because we believe that Matthew and Luke used Mark. So if Matthew and Luke copied it from Mark, that makes Mark one source. Did the author of John use the Gospel of Mark? Not according to the theory we're using in this class. Some people might say yes, some scholars might say yes, but in this class we're going on the theory that the Gospel of John probably didn't use Mark as one of his sources. So you've got the Gospel of John as one source for this. You've got the Gospel of Mark as another source for this. So you have two of what scholars are willing to treat as independent sources, which both have this nice little piece of data, this datum right there. Now the other thing is that it might be interesting for you to know, King of the Jews is not a Christological title that early Christians used about Jesus. Remember in the Gospels, we've seen a lot of different titles for Jesus. He's the teacher, he's the Son of God, he's the Messiah, he's the Holy One of Israel, we just saw. He has a lot of things, and these things are obviously things, early Christians called him Lord, they called him Son of God, but they didn't call him King of the Jews. It was one of the titles of Jesus that apparently the earliest followers of Jesus didn't latch onto. So we don't see it in the letters of Paul, and we don't see it elsewhere in the Gospels. So what scholars have said is, look, this thing, King of the Jews, doesn't look like a Christological confessional title that Christians made up and then put into the Gospel. It goes against the tendency of the Christian writers themselves, because it's not one of their titles. If it had said, this is Jesus of Nazareth, the Lord of heaven and earth, then scholars would say, well, that sounds like a Christian confession. But saying Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, doesn't sound like a Christian confession. So it goes against the tendency of the writers themselves, and we say, well, maybe then it's historical. Maybe it's a little glimpse of history sitting in there. So that's one thing. The sign on the cross, most scholars say that's historical. Now, I'll talk about why that's important. It's a very small detail, but it could be very important. Yes, sir? It could have, exactly. In other words, the question was, didn't this come from the mocking terms in the trial? That's exactly right. The Christians, if you notice, it's the people who are mocking Jesus who call him King of the Jews. And so why, you know, this is not something that the Christian writers want to invent and then put in the story. Exactly, that supports that point. So that is a nice little detail. One other thing that scholars often say may well be historical. Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist. Now notice why would scholars say this is historical? Well, there's not complete agreement about how it happened. There's the Gospel of John doesn't exactly tell you about the baptism of Jesus by John, but it has Jesus and his disciples also baptized in the Jordan, and it has Jesus very much connected to John the Baptist in the beginning of its Gospel. The other Gospels do have Jesus baptized by John. But notice how the story goes along. All of the writers who have the Gospel of John, who have Jesus baptized by John the Baptist, they have Jesus come to John the Baptist, and they say, I want to be baptized. And John the Baptist says, oh, no, I shouldn't baptize you. You're the big kahuna. You're bigger than I am. I should, you know, I'm not worthy to untie your sandals. So I should be baptized by you. I shouldn't be baptizing you. And Jesus says, no, 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 it's okay, baptize me. And so he does it, and then you have the confession and the voice from heaven and that sort of thing. Notice what's going on here. The gospel writers are very concerned because they know that it could be interpreted that John baptizing Jesus makes John superior to Jesus and makes Jesus a disciple of John. And they're not comfortable with that because, of course, they believe Jesus is the Messiah. And so he's therefore superior to John the Baptist. And John the Baptist was just a prophet or a precursor to Jesus. So the story is told to play down this baptism a bit and make Jesus come out as insisting on the baptism, wanting to do it for the right kinds of reasons, but not making Jesus a disciple of John. And also, this tradition about the baptism of Jesus is in different sources in different ways. So again, scholars say the baptism of John the Baptist in baptizing Jesus doesn't look like something early Christians would make up. In fact, you can even see that they try to tone down its implications. So it's not something they're likely to make up. It kind of goes against their tradition of raising Jesus up completely, and therefore it may be historical. Notice what we've got then. We've got two very small details that a lot of scholars would say probably are historical because they seem to be witnessed by more than one source, and they also seem to go against the theological tendency of the documents in which they're found. And they frame the gospel of Jesus. The baptism of Jesus, the beginning of his ministry, and the charge on the cross at the end of his ministry. And now I'm going to back up. Those two events, let's just say, I'm going to argue that those two are certain historical events in the life of Jesus. And then we'll fill in some of the other details later. But right now, let's talk about method. How did I get here? First method. First little rule, and this is something that a lot of people use when they do historical Jesus research. It took all the 20th century for people kind of to develop these rules and to spell them out in scholarship. But this is kind of where we are now. The first rule, multiple attestation. That means when you have more than one independent source that has a saying or an event about Jesus, you tend to give it a little more weight. Now, of course, what are independent sources? If you have something in both Matthew and Luke, that doesn't count as two independent sources, right? Because both Matthew and Luke could have gotten that from Mark, or they could have gotten it from Q. But if you have something in Mark and you have something in John, well, those are two independent sources. Him as an independent source, because he's not verbatim quoting the other Gospels most of the time. So if you have an event or a saying that occurs in Mark and John and Q, or in Thomas, those are three independent sources. What if it also occurs in Paul's letters? There's another independent source. As we'll see, that there are some places where Paul gives us a little clue about something. And then obviously you can take Q as being one of those sources. So if something is in both Matthew and Luke, but it's not in Mark, then you can say it's in Q. And sometimes people would even say you have one form of a parable that seems to have occurred in Q, and you have a different form of that parable that seems to have occurred in Mark. And then you can say, okay, we have this one parable in two independent sources. One is Q and one is Mark. But that's kind of complicated because, of course, the very definition of what's in Q is something that's in both Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark, usually. But if something is in more than one source, it fits this criterion. Now remember, criteria is the plural, criterion is the singular, okay? Second, actually, let me illustrate this again. One of the things that the sign of the cross is one of the things, because it goes, the divorce sayings is another situation. According to Mark 10 and Matthew 19, you have this saying, what God has joined together, let no man put asunder. And then you have a few other sayings. Clearly, Jesus, in this passage, is teaching no divorce for his disciples. No divorce at all, period, none. It's against the rule to get divorced. But then Matthew 5:32 has a parallel with Luke 16:18, which makes it look like a Q source, and that has this wording. Every man who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and whoever marries a woman who has been divorced by her husband commits adultery. In other words, there's another teaching on divorce here, both of which it also forbids divorce and remarriage, but it's not the same wording as in Mark. So scholars say that looks like a Q saying on divorce, in which Jesus still forbids divorce and remarriage, but it's not the same wording as the Mark saying. So we have two separate sayings in different wordings, but they both have Jesus forbidding divorce, and at least divorce and remarriage. One in Q, one in Mark, two independent sources. It's really neat then when we find Paul in 1 Corinthians 7, 10 through 11 says this. So this is Paul, a quotation from Paul. To those who are married, I command, that is Paul, and then he says, not I, but the Lord. So Paul even knows he's quoting a saying of the Lord Jesus. So he goes on to say that the woman must not separate from her husband. If indeed she does separate, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband, and a man must not put away his wife. Now, most of us believe that's Paul's wording because you can tell the way he's kind of fudging around with some of the details of the saying. But at least Paul gives a witness that he knows of an anti-divorce saying by Jesus also. Three separate independent witnesses that Jesus taught against divorce. One from Mark that Matthew copies, one from Q that both Mark, Matthew, and Luke have, and one from Paul. So that passes the multiple attestation rule. But it also passes the next rule, which is dissimilarity. When you find something in a source, an early Christian source, that seems to go against the very inclinations of that source or of early Christianity, it's more likely to be historical. Something that swims against the tide of early Christian expectation. Now, why does the divorce saying is multiply attested? It also passes the dissimilarity thing because almost all of these authors, except for Mark, they both seem to know that Jesus prohibited divorce entirely, but then they go on to modify the rule a bit. Because, I mean, let's face it, people get divorced. Early Christians got divorced. So Paul says, okay, well, you're not supposed to get divorced, but if you do get divorced, then you should do this. So the very writers who pass on an anti-divorce saying also fudge the saying just a bit, which shows that the saying is more radical than their own ethics are. In other words, the anti-divorce saying is dissimilar to the very practices of these early Christians. It's more radical than they are themselves practicing. And that's a clue that the saying itself goes back to the historical Jesus, according to this method. So dissimilarity is any kind of thing that doesn't fit early Christian tendencies. The sign on the cross, I already talked about that. It wasn't a confession of Jesus. The baptism of John, it's not something they likely would have invented. There's another one, the swords at Jesus' arrest. And according to Mark 14:47, and it's followed by Matthew and Luke, somebody had a sword at Jesus' arrest in the garden. And somebody used it. According to the different traditions, it was Peter, according to John, and somebody made, the others don't name, somebody whacked off the ear of the high priest's slave. But there's these different stories about Jesus, somebody in Jesus' entourage was armed. And in some of the sources, one of the sources, there are two of them armed. There are two swords. Others is one sword. Now, I think this is historical. Why? Because all the gospel writers want to go out of their way to say Jesus was not mounting a violent revolution. He was not a criminal. This was not an armed rebellion. He's completely innocent of any political charge of insurrection. But if Jesus' disciples were armed with swords at his arrest in the middle of the night at the Passover in Jerusalem, that's insurrection, folks. The Romans did not allow Jews just to go around in the middle of the night in gardens carrying swords. For a Jew to be armed at the Passover, an especially dangerous time that the Romans were really worried about, for a Jew to be armed following around a guy who some people were saying was the king of the Jews, you can be arrested for that. You can be crucified for that. So I don't think early Christians invented it. I think some of these early Christians knew that at least one and possibly more of Jesus' disciples were armed at his arrest. So that's another, why do I see that? Because it's not something they would have invented. In fact, it goes against their tendency. There's another passage, Mark 10:18. Mark 10:18, which is also in Luke 18:19. You may have come across this. The man comes and asks Jesus about, what should I do to have eternal life? What's the good thing for me to do? And Jesus says, why do you ask me about the good? There's no one good but God. Now, apparently, Mark, writing that, didn't have a theological hiccup. But now let me, I'm a good Episcopalian, okay? Why should you ask Jesus about the good? God's the only one who's good. Sound weird? If Jesus is actually God, then you wouldn't say it like that. In other words, this sounds like, whoever's this saying, it sounds like Jesus himself is denying that he's God. Don't ask me about the good. The only one who knows about good is God. And then Jesus goes on and answers the question. I think this saying was actually something like this was said by the historical Jesus. Why? Because early followers of Jesus believed Jesus was God in some sense. I don't think this is something they would invent. It goes against their confession. It goes against their theology. So it's one of these cases where it's dissimilar to their faith. And therefore, we tend to give it higher grade when it comes to historicity. A couple of other criteria are a bit weaker. These are the two strongest. Social coherence. This is when you see something that is either anachronistic and it doesn't look like it would fit in with the life of Jesus, or it does fit very well with the life of Jesus. If I decide, for example, on lots of different other sayings that I've decided are historical because of these other reasons, and then something looks like it, a saying of Jesus looks like it's apocalyptic, and I've already established that Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet, then I'm going to say, well, it coheres with the social situation of Jesus as an apocalyptic prophet in Galilee. Or take a negative example. In Matthew 18, there are a lot of rules about what you should do in the church. The very word church is used. Almost all of us scholars would say a lot of that stuff in Matthew 18 about the church rules, the church leadership, that's not historical. Why? Because the church didn't exist in Jesus' lifetime. Jesus sounds like he's giving rules about a constitution for a church. But we think that's anachronistic. The church is something that developed after Jesus' death, when his followers came to believe that he had been raised from the dead and then they should continue doing things in his name. But in Jesus' own lifetime, traveling around Galilee, talking about, now when you have the church, you should meet on Sundays. I think for Easter you should wear white. Jesus didn't do this sort of thing. So all of that stuff in Matthew 18 that looks very much like a later church life, we believe was read back into the life of Jesus by the author of Matthew or other people. And then the last thing is, the last criterion is rather weak. It's called the criterion of coherence. And this basically just says, if you establish something as being historical about Jesus by these other stronger criteria, and then something else seems to cohere with it, then you can kind of throw it in the pot. But it's a very loose kind of criterion to use for historical purposes. Now, so where are we? That's the methodology. If we're going to come up with some basic ideas about Jesus, here's where I would say I would end up with. And there's some of this that's very controversial. I would say, though, that Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet, an apocalyptic Jewish prophet. One of the reasons that Jesus' life was framed by two apocalyptic events. If Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist, and John the Baptist seems clearly to have been preaching some kind of apocalyptic message about the coming kingdom, that means I think that Jesus was originally a follower of John the Baptist, although the later gospel writers will play that down. If Jesus was a follower of an apocalyptic Jewish prophet, I think that at least means that the beginning of his own ministry was wreathed in that apocalyptic Jewish prophecy kind of world. And he was executed on a charge of sedition as being the king of the Jews against the law. Only the Roman Senate got to make kings. And if Jesus was going around claiming, and I'm not saying he was claiming, but if other people were claiming that he was the king of the Jews, the only way to understand that, I think, in this situation is that he believed that he was going to be the Messiah that would come at the end of time and overthrow the Romans. So his death was also apocalyptic. The temple incident, we could talk about that. Did Jesus go in and throw the money changers out and cleanse the temple, as it said? I think that's historical. It goes against the tendency of the Gospels to portray Jesus as nonviolent and non-confrontational in that last week. I think he therefore did it. What did it mean? I think this is more debatable. I think it was a prophecy meant to enact what he saw would be coming the future destruction of the temple by God in some kind of apocalyptic event at the end of time. I think Jesus was therefore a lower class Jewish peasant who spoke mainly Aramaic. I think he had a group of disciples of 12. I won't go into some of these, but I think he actually did form 12 of his disciples to be an inner core group. I think even that's apocalyptic. Why would he have 12 disciples? Why did he choose the number 12? Because there were 12 tribes of Israel that would be reconstituted at the end of time, according to Jewish expectation. I think there are also women that were part of his inner circle, and this is because women later in early Christianity were marginalized from leadership positions, but there's all kinds of evidence, from the resurrection narratives to the presence of Mary Magdalene to other women, that they were part of his inner circle of disciples. I think that he never taught the end of the Jewish law, but I think he did teach what was something of a liberalizing version of the Jewish law. In other words, that the ethical treatment of your fellow human beings counted as more important than actual details of observing the Jewish law, such as keeping kosher, washing your hands, keeping the Sabbath. Did Jesus think he was the Messiah? I think this is a really big problem. I don't know. There seem to be places where he makes no open claim to messiahship in his ministry, except in the Gospel of John, remember. So the Gospel of John, actually, we tend to treat that as less historically reliable in these things because it looks very much more Christian theological confession. But in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus doesn't make open claims to being Messiah. On the other hand, he was executed for being king of the Jews. So the Romans at least thought he was claiming to be the Messiah, or they thought that other people were claiming that about him. But what he thought himself is very difficult. One of the things, though, I think we can say for sure, this is where I'll end today, Jesus himself, I believe, never saw himself as the founder of Christianity. He didn't think about himself as starting a new religion. I believe he saw himself as preparing the people of Israel to make them ready for the apocalyptic inbreaking of God that was to happen at the end of time, or at the end of our time, and the setting up of a new time of the kingdom of God, the kingdom of Israel, that would incorporate the whole world. So the way I would do this is Jesus was an apocalyptic Jewish prophet who was executed because the Romans at least believed that he or his disciples were making dangerous claims that he was the king of the Jews. That's all you get on the historical Jesus. Sorry. Next time we start on Paul. See you next time.
Well, there you go. Are you still with us? Or have you fallen asleep? Okay, for those who are still watching, let me just recap what we've done here. We've touched on women, Manichaeism, and the historical Jesus in this session. Open discussion looks like it's not going to happen. We've been running for close to 4 hours anyway, so it's time to take a break for today. Thank you ever so much for watching. If you got this far, remember, I love coffee.